Eleanora Ashford was 3 hours old when her father sold her future for the price of a gambling debt. She did not know this, of course. She was busy doing what newborns do, which is mostly screaming and gripping at air with fingers no bigger than matchsticks. But while she fought her way into the world in an upstairs bedroom of Ashford Manor, her father sat in the study below, drinking brandy with a man who smelled of old money and older grudges, and signed a piece of paper that would follow Eleanora for the next 22 years of her life. The man across the desk was Lord Harold Hale, the Duke of Thornbury. He was 61. He had gout in his left foot, a dead wife, and a 5-year-old son named Cedric, who would one day inherit the largest estate in the south of England. What Harold Hale did not have was patience. He had lent Philip Ashford an obscene amount of money over the course of 4 years, and Philip Ashford had repaid exactly none of it. "A daughter," Philip said, pouring another glass with hands that did not shake, because he had trained them not to. "Margaret just delivered a daughter." Harold Hale looked at him the way a man looks at a dog that has just done something surprisingly clever. "And what precisely am I supposed to do with that information?" "Marry her to your boy." The room was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Somewhere upstairs, the baby stopped crying. "She is 3 hours old, Philip." "She will not always be 3 hours old." Harold Hale leaned back in his chair and considered the offer the way he considered all things, which was slowly, and with the certainty that the world would wait for him to finish thinking. He had a son who would need a wife. Philip Ashford had a daughter who would need a title. The debts between them were large enough to be embarrassing, and Harold Hale did not tolerate embarrassment. "A betrothal contract," Harold said, "binding. Not a suggestion. Not a courtship arrangement, a contract." Philip nodded. He did not look toward the ceiling where his wife was recovering from 14 hours of labor. He did not think about the girl upstairs whose name had not yet been chosen. He thought about the number on the ledger that had been keeping him awake for 700 consecutive nights, and he thought about how that number would disappear if he simply wrote his name at the bottom of this page. He signed. Harold Hale signed beneath him. And Eleanora Ashford, who had existed for less than a single day, became the promised bride of a boy she had never met, in a house she had never seen, for a life she had never chosen. Nobody asked the baby. Nobody thought to. The contract was written in language that sounded ancient, because it was. Phrases like "in perpetuity of bond" and "upon the occasion of her 18th year" filled paragraphs that boiled down to one brutal sentence. Eleanora Ashford would marry Cedric Hale, or the Ashford family would owe the Hale estate every penny of the original debt, plus interest, plus whatever additional humiliation Harold Hale felt like extracting. It was not a generous arrangement. It was not meant to be. Philip Ashford tucked the contract into his desk drawer, locked it, and went upstairs to meet his daughter. Margaret was pale and exhausted, propped against a stack of pillows that had been embroidered by her own mother 30 years earlier. The baby was in her arms, small, red, furious at the world already. "She has your chin," Margaret said. Philip looked at the child and felt something he did not expect. It was not love, exactly, because Philip Ashford was not built for love, in any shape that would be recognizable to most people. It was something closer to recognition. He looked at this tiny, wailing creature and saw himself, which was the only thing Philip Ashford had ever truly cared about anyway. "Eleanora," he said, "after my mother." Margaret smiled. She did not know about the contract. She would not know for another 6 years, and when she finally found out, she would not object. Not because she agreed with it, but because Margaret Ashford had spent her entire marriage learning that objecting to Philip's decisions was like objecting to weather. You could stand in the rain and shout, or you could find an umbrella. Margaret always found the umbrella. Eleanora grew. She was not a particularly remarkable baby, and she was not a particularly remarkable toddler, and she was not a particularly remarkable child. She was, however, obedient. This was the quality her parents valued above all others, and it was the quality they cultivated, with the same careful attention a gardener gives to a vine being trained along a wall. They did not bend her with cruelty. They bent her with expectation. "A lady holds her fork like this, Eleanora." "A lady does not run in the hallway, Eleanora." "A lady speaks when spoken to, and only then, and only as much as is necessary, and never about herself. By the time she was 6, Eleonora could navigate a formal dinner table with the precision of a small, well-dressed general. She knew which glass was for water and which was for wine, even though she was not allowed to drink wine. She knew how to curtsy in 4 different regional styles, a skill that impressed exactly the kind of people who valued that sort of thing, and bored everyone else in the room. At 6, she also learned about Cedric. Her mother told her on a Tuesday afternoon in the garden, in the same tone she might have used to explain that rain comes from clouds. "You are going to marry a duke one day, darling. His name is Cedric Hale. He is 11 years old and lives at Thornbury Hall." Eleonora considered this information. "What does he look like?" "I am sure he looks very nice." "Will he be kind?" Margaret paused. It was such a small pause that most people would have missed it, but Eleonora was already developing the habit of watching her mother's face, the way animals watch the sky before a storm. She noticed the pause. She filed it away. "He will be a duke," Margaret said, which was not an answer, but was delivered with enough confidence to sound like one. That evening, Eleonora sat in her room and stared at the miniature portrait her mother had given her. A small, oval painting of a boy with dark hair and a serious expression who was apparently her future. He looked bored. Eleonora studied his face and tried to feel something about it, the way she had been told girls were supposed to feel things about boys they were going to marry. She felt nothing. The boy in the portrait was a stranger, and strangers did not become less strange simply because someone had signed a piece of paper. She put the portrait on her nightstand anyway, because that seemed like the correct thing to do. It stayed there for 16 years. Every night, the last thing Eleonora saw before she closed her eyes was the painted face of a boy who was growing into a man she did not know, in a house she visited once a year, where she was treated with the kind of politeness that is worse than rudeness, because at least rudeness contains honesty. The annual visits to Thornbury Hall began when Eleonora was 7. Her mother would dress her in something stiff and uncomfortable. Her father would put on his best coat, and the 3 of them would ride for 4 hours in a carriage that smelled of old leather and unspoken anxiety. Margaret would spend the journey coaching Eleonora on what to say, what not to say, how to sit, how to smile, how to be the kind of girl that a duke's family would be pleased to absorb into their bloodline. "Do not fidget, Eleonora." "I am not fidgeting, Mama." "You are touching your hair. That is fidgeting." Eleonora would drop her hand and stare out the window and watch England slide by in shades of green and gray, and she would think about the boy in the portrait and wonder if he was being coached too. If someone was telling him how to sit and how to smile and how to be the kind of boy that an Ashford girl would be pleased to accept, nobody was coaching Cedric. She would learn this eventually. Nobody was coaching Cedric because nobody at Thornbury Hall thought about the Ashford arrangement with anything other than mild administrative interest, the way one might think about an insurance policy or a fence that needed mending. It was a task on a list. It would be handled when the time came. In the meantime, Cedric had horses to ride and tutors to ignore and an entire estate to inherit, and the small, quiet girl who visited once a year was about as central to his life as the wallpaper in the 3rd guest bedroom. Their first meeting was held in the formal drawing room at Thornbury Hall, which was a room designed to make visitors feel small. It succeeded. Eleonora stood in the center of a carpet that was older than her family's entire fortune, and looked up at a boy who was already taller than her father, and who had the particular expression of a person who has been pulled away from something interesting to do something tedious. "Eleonora," he said, "how do you do?" It was not a question. It was a formality, delivered with the enthusiasm of a clock striking noon. He shook her hand, the way you shake hands with a business associate at a function you did not want to attend. "Very well, thank you," she said, because that was what she had been taught to say. They stood there. The silence grew roots. Cedric's father, who was by then confined to a chair and breathing in the labored way of a man whose body was preparing to give up, watched the 2 children with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been indigestion. It was difficult to tell with Harold Hale. "Show her the garden, Cedric." Cedric showed her the garden. He walked 3 steps ahead of her the entire time and pointed at things without turning around. "That is the fountain. That is the hedge maze. Those are the roses. Father is very fond of roses." Eleonora followed him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She watched the back of his head and thought about how strange it was that this person, this tall, bored, indifferent person, was supposed to become the most important person in her life. She could not imagine it. She could not imagine him caring whether she was in the room at all. At dinner, Cedric sat across from her and spoke to his father about horses. Eleonora ate in silence and studied him from behind her water glass. He had his father's jaw but none of his father's weight. He moved like someone who had never been told to sit still, and when he laughed at something a servant said, the laugh came easily, without performance, as natural as breathing. He did not laugh at anything Eleonora said, but that was because Eleonora did not say anything worth laughing at. She said please, and thank you, and the soup is lovely, and that was the full extent of her contribution to the evening. On the carriage ride home, her mother asked how she liked him. He is very tall, Eleonora said. Margaret waited for more. There was no more. Tall is good, Margaret said eventually. Tall is a fine quality in a husband. Philip stared out the window and said nothing. He was calculating. He was always calculating. The debts had been absorbed by the contract, but the contract demanded maintenance, performance, appearances. The Ashford family had to remain suitable. Suitable cost money that they did not have, which meant borrowing money that they could not repay, which meant the same spiral that had created the contract in the first place. Only now, it had a face and a name, and it visited once a year in stiff clothing. Eleonora turned 9, then 11, then 14. The visits continued. Each year, Cedric was polite. Each year, he showed her something: the stables, the library, the portrait gallery with its rows of dead Hales staring down from gilt frames like a jury. Each year, his eyes landed on her and then slid away, as if she were a painting he had already seen and did not need to study again. She memorized him anyway. The way his hair fell across his forehead, the specific angle of his jaw when he was bored, which was almost always. The way he said her name, Eleonora, 3 syllables flattened into 2, as if even her name was too long for his attention. She was not in love with him. She wanted to make that clear, even if only to herself. She was not in love with Cedric Hale. She was in love with the idea that someone, somewhere, was supposed to choose her, that there was a person in the world who was contractually obligated to find her important. It was not romance. It was arithmetic. And Eleonora was very good at arithmetic. At 15, she overheard something she was not supposed to hear. It was during the annual visit. She had excused herself from the drawing room to find the lavatory and had taken a wrong turn, which was easy to do at Thornbury Hall because the house had been built by people who apparently hated the concept of a straight corridor. She ended up in a narrow passage behind the library, where 2 walls did not quite meet and voices carried like they were designed to. Cedric was speaking to someone. A friend, she thought. A male voice she did not recognize. The Ashford girl comes again next week. That was the friend. So I am told, Cedric, flat, uninterested. And, will you make an effort this time? Cedric laughed. It was not the easy laugh she had catalogued over 8 years of observation. It was shorter, harder. An effort toward what? She barely speaks. Is like being betrothed to a piece of furniture, a well-mannered chair. The friend laughed. Cedric laughed. Eleonora stood in the narrow passage and felt something crack behind her ribs. Not break. Crack. The way ice cracks on a pond when weight is applied to it. The surface holds, you can still walk on it, but you know, with absolute certainty, that underneath the surface, there is something cold and dark and deep enough to drown in. A well-mannered chair. She walked back to the drawing room. She sat down. She smiled. She answered questions about her studies and her embroidery and her plans for the autumn season, and she performed the role of the devoted future bride with a precision that would have impressed a stage actress. And underneath all of it, the crack spread, silently, in every direction, and not a single person in that enormous, expensive, suffocating house noticed. That night at home, Eleonora stood in front of her mirror and looked at herself the way Cedric might look at her. She tried to see what he saw. A small girl with brown hair and a face that was not ugly, but was not the kind of face that stopped anyone in a hallway. A girl who had been trained to be agreeable and had succeeded so thoroughly that she had become invisible. A well-mannered chair. She picked up the miniature portrait from her nightstand. The painted boy looked back at her with the same serious expression he had worn for 9 years, unchanged, unaging, permanently 11, while the real Cedric grew taller and colder and further away from anyone she might have imagined loving. She put the portrait back. She did not cry. Eleanora Ashford had been taught that crying was a private indulgence, like chocolate or sleeping past dawn, and she had internalized that lesson so deeply that she was not entirely sure she still knew how. The machinery was there, somewhere, behind her eyes, rusty from disuse. But the instruction manual had been thrown away years ago. Instead, she sat at her desk and wrote a list. She was always writing lists. Lists of things to remember. Lists of things to improve. Lists of things she would do differently when she was a duchess and no longer had to earn anyone's approval because the approval would be built into her title, like a foundation built into a house. The list she wrote that night had only one item: be more than a chair. She underlined it twice and went to bed. The years that followed were Eleanora's quiet revolution. She could not change the contract. She could not change Cedric. She could not change the fact that her entire life had been designed by other people, for other people's benefit. But she could change the furniture. She asked for a tutor in languages and received one. She asked for books on history and received those too, because her parents were pleased that she was taking an interest in education, which they interpreted as taking an interest in becoming a better duchess, rather than taking an interest in becoming a better person. The distinction did not matter to them. It mattered enormously to Eleanora. She learned French, then Italian, then enough Latin to read the betrothal contract herself, which she did one afternoon, when her father was out riding and the study was empty. She sat in his chair, behind his desk, and read the document that had defined her life, and the language was so dry and clinical that it made her want to laugh or scream, and she was not sure which. Upon the occasion of her 18th year, the party of the first part shall present the aforementioned daughter for matrimonial union, with the party of the second part's eldest male heir. Present, like a gift, like a thing wrapped in paper and handed across a table. She put the contract back. She locked the drawer. She went to the garden and pulled weeds for an hour, until her hands were dirty and her mind was quiet. 17 came, the final visit before the wedding year. Eleanora arrived at Thornbury Hall in a dress her mother had spent 3 months selecting, and found Cedric standing in the entrance hall with the expression of a man who had just remembered he had an appointment he could not avoid. "Eleanora," he said, 2 syllables again. "You look well." "Thank you, Cedric. You look well also." They regarded each other across 6 feet of marble floor, and Eleanora thought about all the things she had learned to say in 3 languages, all the words she had accumulated like coins in a jar, and how none of them were the right words for this moment, which required something honest, and Eleanora had been trained in every language except honesty. "Shall I show you the new wing?" he asked. Father had it renovated. Harold Hale had died 2 years prior. Cedric was the Duke now. He wore it the way some men wear new suits, constantly adjusting, checking the fit, not yet comfortable in the shape of it. "I would like that," Eleanora said. He showed her the new wing. He walked beside her this time, not ahead, which she noticed and catalogued, and then immediately told herself not to read anything into. The wing was beautiful. High ceilings, light flooding in through tall windows, furniture that cost more than her family's house. "This will be yours," Cedric said, gesturing at a suite of rooms that overlooked the east garden. "After, you know. After. After the wedding. After the contract was fulfilled. After she was presented like a gift and absorbed into this house and this family and this life that had been waiting for her since she was 3 hours old. It is lovely," she said, as Cedric nodded. He opened his mouth as if to say something else, something that lived behind his usual politeness, something real. Then he closed it. Whatever it was retreated behind his eyes and disappeared, and the polite, distant mask slid back into place, like a visor lowering. "Dinner is at 7, he said, and left her standing in her future bedroom, surrounded by beautiful things that did not belong to her yet, in a life that did not belong to her yet, in a house where she was expected to become someone she had never been asked if she wanted to be. She touched the wall. It was cold. Everything in Thornbury Hall was cold. Eleanora stood at the window and looked out at the east garden, and thought about the word committed, how it meant promised, how it also meant locked away, how the two meanings had been living in the same word this entire time, pressed together like two passengers in a crowded carriage, and nobody ever seemed to notice that they were going in opposite directions. She was committed. She had been committed since birth. And the carriage was already moving, and the doors were locked, and the road ahead had been paved before she drew her first breath, and the only question left was whether the destination was a home or a sentence. She did not know the answer yet, but she was beginning to suspect. Eleonora returned from that final visit to Thornbury Hall, carrying something she could not name. It sat behind her sternum like a stone she had swallowed, heavy and smooth and impossible to cough up. Her mother interpreted her silence as bridal nerves and prescribed chamomile tea. Her father interpreted her silence as obedience, which was his favorite interpretation of everything Eleonora did. Neither of them was correct. What Eleonora carried was the beginning of a question. It was not a fully formed question yet, because fully formed questions require courage, and Eleonora was still several months away from courage, but the seed of it was there, buried in the soil of 17 years of compliance, and it went something like this: what if I do not want this? She did not say it out loud. She barely said it to herself, but it was there, growing in the dark, and dark things grow faster than anyone expects. The months between the last visit and Eleonora's 18th birthday passed with the strange velocity of time that is running out. January became March, became June, and each morning Eleonora woke up and looked at the miniature portrait on her nightstand and felt the distance between herself and the girl her parents had built, closing like a door on a hinge. She filled the time with preparation, because preparation was the only language her household spoke. Her mother hired a woman named Mrs. Edith Crawley to teach Eleonora the domestic management of a large estate. Mrs. Crawley was 54, built like a wardrobe, and possessed of the terrifying competence of someone who has managed 16 households and never once lost track of the silver inventory. A duchess, Mrs. Crawley announced on her first day, standing in the Ashford morning room with a spine so straight it appeared to have been manufactured rather than grown, is not a decoration. She is an engine. The house runs because she runs it. The staff obeys because she commands. The Duke handles politics and horses. The Duchess handles everything else. Eleonora sat with her hands folded and listened to Mrs. Crawley describe the architecture of a life she had not designed and would not be permitted to modify. Menu planning, household accounts, the management of servants, which Mrs. Crawley discussed with a clinical efficiency that made Eleonora vaguely uncomfortable, as though the people who would cook her meals and wash her clothing were components in a machine rather than human beings with their own names and their own questions and their own versions of being committed to lives they had not chosen. You are taking notes, Lady Eleonora? Yes, Mrs. Crawley. She was not taking notes. She was drawing a small bird in the margin of her notebook. The bird was looking out a window. Eleonora did not examine this choice too carefully. Mrs. Crawley stayed for 4 months. In that time, she taught Eleonora how to inspect a kitchen for cleanliness, how to address a complaint from a tenant farmer without making promises the estate could not keep, how to arrange flowers for a formal dinner in 7 different configurations depending on the season and the rank of the guests, and how to smile at a husband's business associates in a way that communicated warmth without encouraging familiarity. The smile should reach the eyes, Mrs. Crawley instructed, but not the teeth. Teeth suggest enthusiasm. Enthusiasm suggests opinions. Opinions are the Duchess's private property. They do not leave the bedroom. Eleonora practiced the smile in her mirror at night. She became excellent at it. She could produce it on command. A warm, close-lipped expression of gracious welcome that gave away absolutely nothing about the person wearing it. It was the perfect mask. It fit so well that some mornings she forgot she was wearing it, and she would catch herself smiling the Duchess smile at her own reflection and wonder which one of them was real. There were fittings, so many fittings. Her mother took her to London 3 times in 2 months to visit a dressmaker named Madame Lucille, who operated out of a shop on Bond Street that smelled of lavender and money. Madame Lucille had dressed 3 duchesses, 2 countesses, and a minor European princess, and she approached the construction of Eleonora's trousseau with the gravity of an architect designing a cathedral. The waist must be taken in, Madame Lucille said, circling Eleonora with pins between her teeth and a measuring tape draped over her shoulder like a predatory animal. She is too thin through the middle. A duchess must have presence. We build the presence with structure. Eleonora stood on a small platform in her undergarments and stared at a point on the far wall, while two women discussed her body as though she were not inside it. This was not a new experience. Her body had always belonged to other people's plans. Her father had signed it away at 3 hours old. Her mother had shaped it with diet and deportment for 17 years. Now Madame Lucille would wrap it in silk and present it to a duke who would receive it the way he received tax documents and dinner invitations, with a nod and a signature, and the faintest possible expression of interest. The color should be ivory, Margaret said from the velvet settee where she sat with a cup of tea balanced on her knee. Not white. White is too bridal. Ivory is more refined.
Ivory it is, Madame Lucille agreed.
Eleonora thought about the difference between ivory and white and decided it was the smallest, most meaningless distinction she had ever encountered, and that it was entirely characteristic of her life that someone was making it on her behalf. The trousseau grew. Dresses for morning, afternoon, evening, and the ambiguous hours between them. Walking dresses, riding habits, dinner gowns, a nightgown that Margaret selected without Eleonora's input, because nightgowns, apparently, were another category of decision that Eleonora was not qualified to make for herself. She watched the dresses accumulate in her wardrobe, like evidence of a life she was being fitted for, and she thought about caterpillars, how they dissolve completely inside the cocoon, how there is a moment when they are neither caterpillar nor butterfly but something in between, something liquid and formless, and entirely without structure, and how that moment must be the most terrifying part of the whole transformation. Eleonora was dissolving. She could feel it. The girl she had been, the obedient, list-making, portrait-studying girl, was coming apart, and what was forming in her place was not yet solid enough to name. She did not tell anyone this. There was no one to tell. Her closest friend was a girl named Charlotte Perry, the daughter of a local clergyman who lived 3 miles down the road, and who had the kind of cheerful, uncomplicated personality that Eleonora found both comforting and slightly exhausting. Charlotte was engaged too, to a solicitor named George, and she talked about her wedding with the breathless excitement of someone who had chosen her own future and could not wait to begin living in it. "George says we shall have a garden," Charlotte told her one afternoon, as they walked along the lane between their houses, hedgerows blooming on either side like green explosions. "A proper garden, not just herbs. Roses. He knows I love roses." "That sounds lovely. And what about Thornbury? What will your garden be like?" Eleonora thought about the east garden she had seen from her future bedroom window. The manicured hedges, the gravel paths raked into lines so precise they looked punitive, the roses that grew in rows like soldiers waiting for inspection. "I imagine it will be very well maintained," she said. Charlotte looked at her sideways. Charlotte had the inconvenient habit of looking at people sideways when she suspected they were not saying what they meant, which was most of the time with Eleonora. "You imagine? Have you not discussed it with him?" "Cedric and I do not discuss gardens." "What do you discuss?" Eleonora considered this question with genuine effort. In 12 years of annual visits, she and Cedric had discussed the weather, the quality of the roads between their estates, the health of various elderly relatives, and the general state of the hunting season. They had not discussed gardens. They had not discussed preferences, dreams, fears, favorite books, least favorite foods, or any of the 1,000 small revelations that build the architecture of knowing another person. "We discuss what is expected," Eleonora said. Charlotte stopped walking. She took Eleonora's hands. Her palms were warm and slightly damp from the summer heat, and the contact was so unexpected that Eleonora almost flinched, because physical affection was another category of experience that had been rationed in the Ashford household like sugar during a shortage. "Eleonora, do you love him?" The question sat between them like a live thing. Eleonora could feel it breathing. "I am committed to him," she said. "That is not what I asked." "I know." Charlotte searched her face for something. Whatever she found there made her squeeze Eleonora's hands tighter, and then release them, with the careful gentleness of someone setting down a glass they are afraid of breaking.
"You deserve to be more than committed," Charlotte said. You deserve to be chosen. Eleonora smiled. The Duchess smile.
Perfect. Warm. Completely empty. Being chosen is for people with options, Charlotte. I am an Ashford. We do not have options. We have obligations. She walked home alone and stood in the garden behind the house and pulled weeds until her fingers were raw and her mind was quiet enough to sleep. The invitations were sent in September, 400 of them, printed on cream cardstock with gold lettering that smelled of importance and finality. The Ashford family requests the honor of your presence at the marriage of Lady Eleanora Catherine Ashford to His Grace, Cedric George Hale, the Duke of Thornbury. Eleanora held one of the invitations and studied it. Her name was there, in gold, linked to his by the word to, which was such a small word to carry so much weight. 2 letters, the entirety of her destiny compressed into a preposition. They are beautiful, Margaret said, arranging the remaining invitations into neat stacks on the dining room table. Madame Renaud did an exceptional job with the lettering. Mama. Yes, darling? Eleonora opened her mouth. The question was there, the one that had been growing in the dark for months, pushing against the inside of her chest, like a plant, pressing against a window. What if I do not want this? What if the life you have built for me is not a life I want to live? What if the girl you trained me to be is not the girl I am? The font is lovely, she said. Margaret beamed. Is it not? I chose it myself. The invitations went out. The replies came back. 400 acceptances. Because nobody declined an invitation from a duke, not even a duke who treated his future wife like a scheduling obligation. Cedric wrote to Eleonora exactly once during the engagement period. The letter arrived in October, delivered by a rider from Thornbury Hall who waited in the kitchen while Eleonora read it in the morning room, with hands that she refused to allow to tremble. The letter was 6 lines long. It addressed her as, Dear Eleonora. It informed her that the chapel had been prepared and that accommodations for her family had been arranged in the north wing. It expressed the hope that she was well. It was signed, Yours, Cedric. Yours. As if that word meant something. As if it had been chosen rather than deployed. Eleonora read the letter 3 times, looking for something between the lines, something human, some evidence that the man she was about to marry had feelings about the event that extended beyond logistics. She found nothing. The letter was efficient, courteous, and completely hollow, and she folded it into a square and placed it inside the miniature portrait's frame, where it sat against the painted face of the boy she had been staring at for 17 years, the only version of Cedric that had ever been entirely hers. She wrote back. Her letter was 12 lines long, which was twice as long as his, and she agonized over every word, because she was trying to do something impossible, which was to be honest, inside a structure that did not permit honesty. She wrote about the autumn colors in the garden. She wrote about a book she was reading on the history of botanical illustration. She wrote about a robin that had built a nest outside her bedroom window, and how she checked it every morning to see if the eggs had hatched. She did not write, I am afraid. She did not write, I do not know you, and I am about to give you my entire life. She did not write, please, just once, look at me like you see me. She signed the letter Eleonora without any possessive pronoun because she did not belong to him yet, and the small act of withholding that word was the only rebellion she could afford. November came. The wedding was set for December the 14th, 6 weeks away. Then 5. Then 4. Eleonora stopped sleeping through the night. She would wake at 3 in the morning and lie in the dark and listen to the house settling around her, the creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to the cold, and she would think about the rooms at Thornbury Hall that were waiting for her, empty and perfect and cold, and she would try to imagine herself filling them, and she could not. She could not picture herself at breakfast in the morning room, with sunlight on the table, and Cedric across from her reading a newspaper. She could not picture herself walking the gardens, or managing the household, or sitting in the drawing room at night, while Cedric did whatever dukes did in the evenings. She tried. She closed her eyes and constructed the scenes like sets on a stage, positioned the furniture and the lighting and the costumes, but when she tried to place herself inside them, the image refused to hold. She kept appearing as a blank space, a gap in the composition, a chair with no one sitting in it, a well-mannered chair. The phrase came back at 3 in the morning, with the precision of a knife finding an old wound, and Eleonora lay in the dark and felt the crack behind her ribs widen by another fraction, and she wondered if there was a version of her life where someone, anyone, had looked at her and seen a person instead of a contract. She got up. She went to her desk. She lit a candle. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Things I want." The pen hovered. The page waited. She wrote, "To be asked." Then she closed the notebook and blew out the candle and went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until the light came through the curtains and another day began, indistinguishable from the one before it, marching her toward a date that someone else had chosen, in a dress that someone else had designed, toward a man who would receive her the way he received everything else in his life, which was with the polite, distant, devastating courtesy of a person who had never once had to earn anything, including her. 3 weeks before the wedding, Eleonora's father called her into the study. Philip Ashford was 51 now, heavier than he had been when he signed the contract, and carrying the particular weariness of a man who has spent his entire life running from something that keeps pace with him, no matter how fast he moves. The debts had not disappeared. The contract had absorbed the original amount, but Philip had borrowed more in the years since. Always more. Always with the assumption that his daughter's marriage to a duke would elevate the family's credit to a level where the numbers would stop mattering. The numbers always mattered. That was the thing about numbers. They did not care about contracts or dukes or daughters. They simply accumulated. "Sit down, Eleonora." She sat. The same chair she had sat in as a child. Smaller now, relative to her body, but somehow still making her feel like a girl, waiting to be told what she had done wrong. "In 3 weeks, you will be a duchess." "Yes, Papa. Everything I have done has been for this moment. Every decision, every sacrifice. You understand that." Eleonora looked at her father and thought about the word sacrifice, and how he used it as though he were the one who had given something up, as though the 22 years of her life that had been shaped and compressed and directed toward this single outcome were his sacrifice rather than hers. "I understand, Papa." "Good." He paused. His fingers drummed on the desk, the same desk where the contract lived in the locked drawer. "There are things a wife must know about managing a husband. Your mother will discuss the specifics, but I want you to understand something fundamental." He leaned forward. His eyes were the same gray as Eleonora's, and for a moment she saw herself in them, the same careful watchfulness, the same habit of calculating before feeling. A duke is not a husband in the ordinary sense. He is an institution. You are not marrying a man, Eleonora. You are merging with a title. The title will outlast both of you. Your job is to serve it. Eleonora sat very still. She could feel the list in her notebook, the one with the single entry, "To be asked." 2 words that suddenly felt like a foreign language, spoken in a country she would never be permitted to visit. "I will serve it well, Papa." Philip nodded. He seemed satisfied. He always seemed satisfied when Eleonora performed compliance, because compliance was the only product he had ever wanted from her, and she had been delivering it on schedule for 22 years, without a single delayed shipment. She left the study. She walked down the hallway. She passed the portrait of her grandmother Eleonora, the woman she had been named after, who had also married a man she did not choose, and had lived a life she did not design, and had died in a house she did not love, and had been remembered only by the name she passed to a granddaughter, who was now walking the same hallway toward the same door. Eleonora stopped in front of the portrait. Her grandmother looked out at her from oil and canvas, with an expression that could have been serenity, or could have been surrender, and the difference between those two things was so small and so enormous that Eleonora stood there for a long time, trying to tell them apart. She could not. She went upstairs. She opened her notebook. She looked at the single entry. "To be asked." She added a second line beneath it. "What would I say if someone did?" She closed the notebook. She did not write the answer, because she did not know it yet. But the question was there now, written in her own handwriting, in her own notebook, in her own room, and it was the first thing in her entire life that belonged entirely to her. 3 weeks until the wedding. The carriage was already moving, but for the first time, Eleonora was not sure she wanted to arrive. Cedric Hale had never wanted to be a duke. This was not something he said out loud, because saying it out loud would have been like complaining about inheriting a continent. People did not sympathize with dukes who did not want to be dukes. People rolled their eyes and poured themselves another drink and thought about all the things they would do with a title and 10,000 acres and a house with 47 rooms, and they concluded that Cedric Hale was either ungrateful or insane, and they were not entirely wrong about either. But the wanting and the having were different countries, and Cedric lived in the gap between them. His father had been a duke the way stone is a mountain. Harold Hale did not perform authority. He was authority. He walked into rooms, and the furniture seemed to rearrange itself around him. Chairs shifting to face his direction. Conversations bending toward his orbit. When he spoke, people listened. Not because what he said was interesting, but because the weight behind it made silence feel dangerous. Cedric was not stone. Cedric was water. He moved around obstacles instead of through them. He charmed where his father commanded. He laughed where his father frowned. He was, by every measurable standard, a disappointing heir, and Harold Hale had spent the last decade of his life trying to correct this deficiency, with the same brute persistence he applied to everything else. You will sit straight at dinner. You will learn to shoot properly. You will stop reading novels and start reading contracts. You will understand that this family is not a family. It is an enterprise, and you are the next managing director whether you like it or not. Cedric sat straight. He learned to shoot. He put down his novels and picked up contracts and read them with the particular misery of a man being force-fed a diet of sand. And then his father died, and the weight of the title landed on his shoulders like a building collapsing, and Cedric discovered that the gap between wanting and having was not a gap at all. It was a grave, and he was standing in it. He was 20 when Harold died. The funeral was enormous. 3 bishops, 2 members of parliament, a representative from the royal household, and 400 mourners who wore black and spoke in hushed voices about what a great man Harold Hale had been. Cedric stood at the front of the chapel and received condolences from people whose names he could not remember and whose sympathy he did not want, and he held himself together with the desperate rigidity of a man who knows that if he bends even slightly, he will break entirely. The title transferred, the estate transferred. The responsibilities, the expectations, the crushing, airless obligation of being the Duke of Thornbury transferred, and Cedric received it all with a nod and a handshake, and then he went to his father's study, and sat in his father's chair, and stared at his father's desk, and thought about the fact that he was 20 years old, and already buried. The first year was administration. Endless, suffocating administration. The estate employed over 100 people. The farms produced income that had to be managed. The tenants had complaints that had to be addressed. The house itself demanded constant attention, a living thing that consumed money and labor the way a furnace consumes coal, relentlessly, without gratitude, without pause. Cedric hired a steward named Mr. Henry Barton to manage the daily operations, because Cedric had quickly realized that managing an estate was not a skill you could learn from reading about it, any more than you could learn to swim by studying water. Mr. Barton was competent, discreet, and possessed of the invaluable quality of never looking surprised when Cedric asked a question that revealed how little he understood about the thing he had inherited. "How do the tenant rents work, Mr. Barton?" "Quarterly payments, Your Grace, adjusted annually, based on acreage and yield." "And if they cannot pay?" Mr. Barton paused in the particular way that servants paused when their employer had asked something that revealed an inconvenient moral compass. "Your father's policy was to allow 1/4 of grace. After that, eviction." Cedric thought about this. What if we allowed 2/4? "Your Grace, with respect, generosity in matters of rent tends to establish precedent. And what precedent does eviction establish?" Mr. Barton had no answer for this, or if he did, he kept it behind the professional expression he wore like a uniform. Cedric changed the policy to 2/4. It was a small thing, but it was the first decision he made as Duke that felt like his own, rather than his father's, and it mattered to him more than any of the large, ceremonial decisions that had preceded it. The second year was Oxford, or rather, it was the completion of Oxford, because Cedric had been enrolled before his father's death, and had returned after the funeral, with the understanding that a duke with a degree was marginally more respectable than a duke without one, though in practical terms, The degree was about as useful as a decorative sword. Oxford was where Cedric learned to breathe. Away from Thornbury Hall, away from the tenants and the staff and the endless parade of decisions that required him to pretend he knew what he was doing, Cedric discovered something he had not expected to find, a version of himself that existed outside the title. He attended lectures on philosophy and literature. He argued with classmates about politics and poetry. He stayed up late in paneled rooms, drinking wine that was not expensive enough to be impressive, and talking about ideas that had nothing to do with acreage or tenant rents or the management of a house with 47 rooms. He made friends, real friends, not the strategic alliances his father had maintained, where every conversation was a negotiation and every handshake was a contract, but genuine friendships built on the reckless foundation of shared laughter and mutual stupidity. His closest friend was a man named Edward Blackwell, the second son of a baron who had no title to inherit and no estate to manage, and who approached life with the cheerful irresponsibility of someone who had been liberated by the accident of birth order. Edward was sharp, irreverent, and constitutionally incapable of taking anything seriously, which made him the perfect counterweight to Cedric's creeping solemnity. "You are brooding again," Edward said one evening in their third year, observing Cedric from across a table, littered with empty glasses, and the remains of a meal that had been adequate but not memorable. "You have the face of a man composing his own eulogy." "I am thinking." "Thinking is just brooding with better posture." "What are you thinking about?" Cedric was thinking about Eleonora. Specifically, he was thinking about the letter he needed to write to confirm arrangements for the annual visit, and about how the prospect of writing that letter filled him with a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. "The Ashford arrangement," he said. Edward's eyebrows rose. Edward had been briefed on the Ashford arrangement during a late-night conversation in their first year, and he had responded with the exact combination of horror and fascination that Cedric had expected. "Ah, the girl, the one you are contractually obligated to marry. That is the one." Edward leaned back in his chair and studied the ceiling, as though the answer to Cedric's problems might be written up there among the plaster moldings. "Have you considered telling her the truth?" "Which truth?" "That you do not want to marry her. That you have never wanted to marry her. That the entire arrangement is an inheritance tax on your emotional life, and you are quietly suffocating under the weight of it." Cedric stared at his glass. The wine was dark and still, and reflected nothing. "She has been preparing for this her entire life, Edward. Her entire family depends on it. I am not going to walk into that girl's drawing room and announce that I find our engagement emotionally inconvenient. So instead you will walk into a chapel and marry someone you do not love because your dead father made a deal with her desperate father over brandy and gambling debts." "Yes. That is the plan. That is the plan." Edward shook his head. "You are going to be a spectacular mess of a husband, Cedric." Cedric did not argue. He finished his wine and wrote the letter and posted it the next morning, and the annual visit proceeded as it always did, which was politely and emptily, and with the terrible efficiency of two people performing a script they had not written. Then he went to Suffolk. The hunt party was hosted by Lord William Prescott, a man whose primary contribution to English society was the ownership of enough land to shoot things on. Cedric attended because Edward had insisted, and because the alternative was returning to Thornbury Hall to spend the weekend reviewing drainage reports with Mr. Barton. He met Vivian Carr on the second evening. She was standing by the fireplace in the Prescott drawing room, holding a glass of wine with the casual authority of someone who had decided long ago that the world's opinion of her was the world's problem, and not hers. She was 31, a widow. Her husband, Sir Arthur Carr, had died 3 years earlier, of a heart that gave out during a card game, which Vivian described with the black humor of a woman who had processed her grief and emerged on the other side of it, with her edges sharpened rather than softened. "He died holding a winning hand," she said when someone asked, which is exactly how he would have wanted to go. The man cared more about cards than he ever cared about cardiology. She had dark hair that she wore without the elaborate architecture most women of her class employed. Her face was not conventionally arranged. Her features were too sharp, her mouth too wide, her expressions too honest, for beauty in the traditional sense. but she was magnetic. People moved toward her the way moths move toward heat, not because the heat is comfortable, but because the alternative is the cold. Cedric was introduced to her by Edward, who seemed to know everyone at the party, and to enjoy none of them as much as he enjoyed Vivian. "Cedric, this is Lady Vivian Carr. Vivian, this is His Grace, the Duke of Thornbury, who is the most reluctant duke in England, and possibly the world." Vivian looked at Cedric with the evaluating directness of a woman who had stopped being impressed by titles approximately 5 minutes after marrying into one. "Reluctant," she repeated. "How refreshing. Most dukes I have met are aggressively enthusiastic about it." "I am enthusiastically reluctant," Cedric said, "which is different." She laughed. And the laugh was the thing. The laugh was the entire catastrophe. It came out of her like something escaping, sharp and sudden and real, with no performance in it, no calculation, no attempt to be charming. It was the laugh of a person who found something genuinely funny and did not care whether anyone else agreed. Cedric had spent his entire life surrounded by people who managed their reactions the way diplomats manage treaties. His father had never laughed without purpose. His mother, who had died when he was 4, existed in his memory only as a series of careful expressions, smiles that were deployed rather than felt, laughter that was permitted rather than produced. Eleonora, the girl waiting for him at the other end of a contract, was so carefully controlled that he sometimes wondered if she had been manufactured rather than born. Vivian was none of those things. Vivian was a crack in the surface of everything Cedric had been taught to value, and through that crack, he could see something he had not known he was looking for. They talked for 3 hours that first evening, about nothing important, about books and horses, and the particular absurdity of English hunting parties, where people who had no particular quarrel with foxes dressed in elaborate costumes to chase them across fields, for reasons that had more to do with social ritual than actual sport. Vivian was sharp. She was funny, in a way that did not ask permission. She made observations that landed with the precision of well-aimed arrows, and she listened to Cedric with a quality of attention he had never experienced before, as though what he was saying was interesting, not because he was a duke, but because he was a person. "You do not talk like a duke," she said at some point in the evening, when the room had thinned and the fire had burned low, and they had moved from standing to sitting in chairs that were angled toward each other like co-conspirators. "I do not know what a duke talks like. Like someone who expects agreement. You talk like someone who expects argument. I was raised by a man who agreed with no one. It creates habits." She smiled. Not a wide smile, a small one. An observation rather than a reaction. "I was married to a man who argued with everyone. It creates different habits." The silence that followed was not the kind of silence Cedric was accustomed to. The heavy, loaded silence of Thornbury Hall, where every pause was filled with obligation and expectation. This silence was light, companionable. It sat between them like a shared meal, and neither of them felt the need to fill it, and that was the moment Cedric understood he was in serious trouble. He returned to Thornbury Hall. He wrote to Eleonora. He performed his duties. He reviewed the drainage reports with Mr. Barton. He sat in his father's study and managed the enterprise that was not a family, and he did all of it with the mechanical precision of a clock that has been wound too tight and is ticking faster than it should. And he wrote to Vivian. The first letter was short, a thank you for the evening's conversation. Polite, appropriate. The kind of letter that could be read by anyone without raising an eyebrow. Her reply was not polite. It was interesting. She wrote about a book she had read, a novel, about a man who inherited a house he did not want, and she described the plot in terms that made it clear she had selected it deliberately, as a message rather than a recommendation. The message was, "I see you. I see the reluctance. I find it compelling rather than pitiable." Cedric read the letter in his study and felt something shift in his chest, a tectonic movement, slow and deep and irreversible, the kind of shift that rearranges the geography of a person without their permission. He wrote back, longer this time, more honest. He wrote about the estate, and the title, and the weight of inheriting a life someone else had designed, and the words came out of him with an urgency that surprised him, as though they had been backed up behind a wall for years, and someone had finally removed a single brick. Vivian replied. She wrote about her marriage. The real version, not the performance she gave at dinner parties. About a husband who had been kind but absent, present in the house but not in the life. A man who occupied space without filling it. She wrote about discovering, after his death, that solitude was not the absence of company, but the absence of connection, and that she had been solitary her entire marriage without realizing it. The letters grew longer, more frequent, more dangerous. Cedric began carrying them in the inside pocket of his coat, where they pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat, and he would reach for them during the day, touching the edges of the paper, the way a man touches a wound to confirm it is still there. He knew what he was doing. He was not stupid enough to be unaware. He was a man engaged to one woman who was falling toward another, and the falling was not a slip or an accident. It was a choice he was making in increments so small that each one, by itself, seemed harmless. One letter, one reply, one evening of honest conversation, one more brick removed from the wall. The wall was coming down. He could see it happening, could feel the structure of his planned life destabilizing, and the part of him that was his father's son, the part that understood duty and obligation, and the weight of a name that would outlast him. That part screamed at him to stop, to put the bricks back, to seal the wall, and return to the script, and marry the Ashford girl, and live the life that had been arranged for him with the same resigned efficiency that had characterized every generation of Hales before him. And the part of him that was just Cedric, just a man who had never wanted to be a duke, that part reached for another letter. He visited Vivian in London in February. A discreet meeting, a walk in a park where neither of them was known. They talked for 2 hours in the cold, and at the end of it Vivian stopped walking and turned to face him and said the thing that nobody had ever said to him before. You do not have to do this, you know. The arrangement, the marriage, the whole orchestrated surrender. You are a duke. You can do whatever you want. The only prison here is the one you are building yourself. Cedric looked at her. She was standing in weak winter sunlight, with her cheeks red from the cold, and her eyes steady and unafraid. And he thought about Eleonora in her quiet, careful life, waiting for him, with the patient resignation of someone who has never been told that waiting is optional. He thought about the contract in his father's desk. He thought about the 400 invitations that would go out in September, with gold lettering, and the weight of 2 families' expectations pressed into every syllable. It is not that simple, he said. Nothing is simple, Vivian replied, but complicated is not the same as impossible. She touched his arm, light, brief, a contact that lasted less than a second and landed in his memory like a permanent scar. He went home to Thornbury Hall. He sat in the study. He did not open the drawer where the contract lived, but he thought about it. He thought about it for a very long time. And outside, the winter kept going, and the calendar kept turning, and the wedding kept approaching with the patient, unstoppable certainty of something that has been set in motion by hands that no longer exist, rolling toward a destination that no one has bothered to question, carrying 2 people who have never once asked each other the only question that mattered. Do you want this? Neither of them asked. Neither of them was ready to hear the answer. The wedding dress arrived on a Thursday in October, 6 weeks before the ceremony, in a box so large that 2 men had to carry it through the front door of Ashford Manor, while Margaret stood in the hallway, directing them, with the focused intensity of a general overseeing a military operation. Careful with the corners, do not tilt it. If you crease the bodice, I will have your wages. The men did not crease the bodice. They transported the box to Eleonora's bedroom and set it on the bed with the reverent delicacy of pallbearers lowering a coffin, which was a comparison Eleonora did not make at the time but would think about later, in the quiet hours when comparisons tend to arrive uninvited. Margaret opened the box. The dress was extraordinary, Belgian lace over ivory silk, hand-stitched by the same team of seamstresses who had spent 3 months building it from measurements and fabric, and the specific vision of a woman who had been planning her daughter's wedding since before the daughter in question could walk. The bodice was structured and elegant. The skirt fell in layers that caught the light and seemed to move independently, as though the fabric had its own intentions. The train was 7 feet long, because Margaret believed that a duchess's train should announce her arrival in a room before she got there. "Try it on," Margaret said. Her eyes were bright. Her hands were clasped at her chest. She looked, for the first time in years, like a woman experiencing genuine emotion rather than performing a careful reproduction of it. Eleonora undressed and stepped into the gown, and Margaret buttoned 32 buttons up her back with fingers that trembled slightly, and when the last button was fastened, Margaret stepped back and pressed both hands to her mouth and made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Oh, Eleonora." Eleonora turned to the mirror. The woman in the glass was a stranger. She was beautiful. Objectively, undeniably, expensively beautiful, in the way that things become beautiful when enough money and attention are applied to them. The dress transformed her ordinary body into something architectural. The lace softened her sharp features. The ivory silk made her skin glow with a warmth she did not feel. She looked like a duchess. She did not look like Eleonora. "It fits perfectly," Margaret whispered. "Madame Lucille is a genius." It did fit perfectly. Every seam aligned with her body, as though the dress had been grown rather than sewn, as though it had been waiting for her specifically, designed to contain her in exactly this shape, in exactly this silhouette, in exactly this version of herself that had been selected by other people for other people's purposes. Eleonora stared at her reflection and thought about display cases, the kind they had in museums. Glass boxes built to hold precious objects in place so that people could admire them without touching them. The object inside the case was valuable, important, worth protecting, but it could not move. It could not turn. It could not leave. The case was both its protection and its prison, and the object would never know which one mattered more, because nobody had ever asked the object how it felt about being displayed. "You are crying," Margaret said, alarmed. Eleonora touched her cheek. She was crying. The tears had arrived without her knowledge or consent, appearing on her face like rain from a sky she had not noticed darkening. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, which left a faint smear on the lace cuff, and Margaret gasped at the smear, as though it were a wound. "It is nothing," Eleonora said. "I am happy." She was not happy, but she had been saying things she did not mean for so long that the words came out smooth and automatic, like coins from a machine, and Margaret accepted them, because Margaret had always accepted Eleonora's performance of contentment as evidence of the real thing. "You will be the most beautiful bride Thornbury Chapel has ever seen," Margaret said, straightening a fold in the skirt with the obsessive precision of a woman whose entire emotional investment in her daughter's life was concentrated in this single garment. Eleonora looked at the mirror again. The beautiful stranger looked back. The dress was taken off, 32 buttons undone. It was hung in the wardrobe behind a linen cover, where it occupied space like a ghost, a future version of Eleonora, suspended in the darkness, waiting to be worn. She closed the wardrobe door. She sat on her bed. She thought about the fitting rooms she had visited over the past year, the measuring tapes and pins, and Madame Lucille circling her like a sculptor evaluating a block of marble. She thought about how many hours had been spent shaping her exterior, while nobody, not a single person, had spent even a minute examining what was happening underneath. The seamstresses had taken her measurements: bust, waist, hips, the distance from shoulder to floor. They had numbers for every dimension of her body. They had a pattern that captured her physical shape with scientific accuracy, but there was no pattern for the thing she was becoming inside the dress. There was no measurement for the growing distance between who she appeared to be and who she actually was. She opened her notebook. The list was still there. 2 entries. To be asked. What would I say if someone did? She added a third. I would say no. She looked at the words. They sat on the page like something illegal, contraband smuggled into a life that did not permit dissent. 3 words that contained enough explosive force to detonate the contract, the wedding, the invitations, the dress, the entire carefully constructed architecture of obligation that 2 families had been building for 22 years. She crossed them out, heavily, 3 times, until the original words were buried under ink so thick they became illegible, and then she tore the page out of the notebook and ripped it into pieces so small they could never be reassembled, and she dropped the pieces into the fireplace and watched them burn, and the fire consumed them in less than a second, and the smoke rose and disappeared, and the words were gone. But the feeling that had produced them was not gone. The feeling was still there, sitting behind her sternum like a second heart, beating at a different rhythm, and no amount of tearing and burning and crossing out was going to silence it. November arrived like a guest, who does not know they are unwelcome. The weeks compressed, the wedding preparations accelerated, the house filled with deliveries, flowers from London, table linens from a supplier in Bath, silver candlesticks that Margaret had ordered specially because the Ashford family's existing candlesticks were, in her assessment, insufficiently grand for a duchess's wedding breakfast. Philip watched the expenses accumulate with the thinly concealed panic of a man who is spending money he does not have on an event he cannot afford for a daughter he has already sold. The wedding was costing more than the original debt that had created the contract, which was an irony so precise that it would have been funny if it were happening to someone else. "We cannot afford the orchids," he told Margaret one evening after dinner, standing in the study, with a ledger open on his desk and a glass of brandy in his hand that he was drinking faster than was advisable. "We cannot afford not to afford the orchids. The Thornberry family will judge everything, the flowers, the linens, the food. This is not a wedding, Philip. It is an audition. An audition we are paying for. An audition that will determine whether our daughter is respected or tolerated. There is a difference. The orchids stay." The orchids stayed. The bills arrived. Philip locked himself in the study and stared at numbers that did not add up, and would never add up, because the fundamental mathematics of the Ashford family had been broken for decades, and the wedding was not a solution. It was the final, spectacular expression of a problem that had begun long before Eleonora was born. Eleonora was not told about the financial strain. She was told about the orchids. She was told about the seating arrangements, which Margaret was constructing with the strategic complexity of a chess master planning 7 moves ahead. She was told about the menu for the wedding breakfast, which featured 8 courses because anything fewer than 8 would, in Margaret's estimation, suggest provincial origins. "The third course is a consommé," Margaret announced at breakfast one morning, reading from a handwritten list that had been revised so many times the paper was soft from handling. Followed by turbot with hollandaise. Then the lamb. "Mama, do the guests truly require 8 courses?" Margaret looked at Eleonora with the expression of a woman who has just been asked whether the sun truly requires rising. "This is the wedding of a duchess, Eleonora. 8 courses is the minimum." Eleonora ate her toast and said nothing. 2 weeks before the wedding, Charlotte came to visit. They walked the familiar lane between their houses, but the hedgerows were bare now, stripped to skeleton branches by the November wind, and the path that had been green and blooming during their last walk was gray and exposed, and the change felt significant, in a way that Eleonora did not want to examine. "Are you nervous?" Charlotte asked. "I am prepared. That is not the same thing." "No, it is not." Charlotte linked her arm through Eleonora's, and they walked in silence for a while, and the wind pushed against them, and the bare branches clattered overhead like applause from an empty theater. "George and I had a fight last week," Charlotte said. "About curtains. Can you imagine? Curtains. He wants green. I want blue. We argued about it for 40 minutes. And at the end, he said, very seriously, that marriage is about compromise. And I said, equally seriously, that compromise does not mean green. And then we both started laughing. And I knew." "Knew what?" "That it was right. That fighting about curtains with him was better than agreeing about everything with someone else. That the fight was the intimacy. Does that make sense?" Eleonora thought about Cedric. She tried to imagine fighting with him about curtains. She could not. She could not imagine fighting with him about anything, because fighting requires the assumption that your opinion matters, and in 12 years of polite, careful, scheduled interaction, Cedric had never once given her the impression that her opinion on any subject, including curtains, held any weight whatsoever. "Cedric and I do not fight," she said. Charlotte stopped walking. "Eleonora, listen to me. You are about to marry this man. You are about to live with him, in that enormous house for the rest of your life. And you have never fought with him. You have never disagreed with him. You have never had a conversation with him that lasted longer than the time it takes to eat a meal. I know. Do you not see the problem?" "I see it, Charlotte." "Then what are you going to do about it?" The wind blew. The branches rattled. Eleonora stood on the gray path between the bare hedgerows and looked at her friend and felt the words rise up in her throat, the truth. The whole desperate, unspeakable truth, and for one wild second, she almost let them out. I do not want this. I have never wanted this. I have been walking toward this my entire life, and I have never once been asked whether I want to arrive. And the answer is no, and the answer has always been no, and the only person I have ever told is a notebook that I burned. I am going to be a very good Duchess, she said. Charlotte's face did something complicated. It was not disappointment, exactly, because Charlotte was too kind for disappointment. It was something closer to grief. The grief of watching someone you care about walk into a room you know they will not leave, and being unable to stop them because they have decided that the room is where they belong. You are going to be a very good Duchess, Charlotte repeated. But Eleonora, are you going to be a very good Eleonora? Well, the question hung in the air like smoke. Eleonora did not answer it. She could not. The answer required a version of herself that did not yet exist, a version that had opinions and preferences, and the dangerous, thrilling, terrifying belief that those opinions and preferences mattered. That version was coming. She could feel it, forming in the dark the way all transformations happen, slowly, invisibly, in the space between what is and what might be. But it was not here yet. 10 days before the wedding, the dress was tried on a final time. Margaret supervised. The seamstress made a minor adjustment to the left sleeve. 32 buttons were fastened. The veil was pinned. The shoes were placed on Eleonora's feet. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror in her mother's bedroom, the large mirror with the gilt frame that had been in the family for 3 generations, and the woman who looked back at her was complete, finished. A product delivered to specification, assembled from lace and silk and 22 years of unquestioning obedience, and she was perfect, and she was hollow, and the perfection and the hollowness were the same thing. There she is, Margaret said, standing behind Eleonora with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face. My Duchess. Not my daughter. My Duchess. Eleonora noted the distinction. She filed it away with all the other distinctions she had collected over the years, the small, cutting observations about the difference between being loved and being useful, between being valued and being deployed. Your Duchess, she said. The words came out flat, empty. 2 words that should have been full of gratitude and warmth, and were instead exactly what they were, a confirmation of transfer, a receipt. Margaret did not notice the flatness. Or if she did, she chose not to investigate it, which was Margaret's particular talent, the ability to detect emotional currents and choose not to swim in them. The dress was removed, the buttons were undone, the veil was folded, the shoes were returned to their box, and Eleonora stood in her undergarments in her mother's bedroom and felt the cold air on her skin, and thought about the fact that in 10 days, she would put all of it back on, every piece of the costume, every element of the disguise, and she would walk into a chapel and say words that someone else had written, and make promises that someone else had negotiated, and become a person that someone else had designed, and the girl she was now, the girl standing barefoot on the cold floor, with goosebumps on her arms, and a question burning in her chest. That girl would cease to exist. She dressed in her own clothes. She went downstairs. She sat in the garden despite the cold, and watched her breath form small clouds in the November air, and each cloud appeared and disappeared, temporary as everything, permanent as nothing, and she sat there until the light failed, and the cold became unbearable, and her mother sent a servant to bring her inside. 7 days before the wedding, she received a package from Thornbury Hall, a gift from Cedric, a necklace, sapphires set in gold, with a note that read, "For the day, yours, Cedric." She held the necklace in her palm. The sapphires were cold and blue and expensive, and they caught the light and threw it back in fragments, and she thought about how strange it was that this man, this stranger she was about to marry, had chosen something beautiful for her, without knowing what she looked like when she was not performing, without knowing what she loved or feared or wanted, without knowing anything about her except that she was the girl in the contract, the name on the document, the future that had been filed under the category of obligation and left in a drawer. The necklace was beautiful. It was also the loneliest gift she had ever received. She put it in the box with the dress and the veil and the shoes, in the wardrobe behind the linen cover, where her future self hung in the darkness, assembled and waiting, and she closed the door and walked away and did not look back. 5 days. 4. 3. The house filled with relatives, aunts and uncles and cousins she saw once a year at gatherings, people who shared her blood but not her life, who kissed her cheek and squeezed her hands and told her how lucky she was, how blessed, how envied. A duke, Eleonora. Can you imagine? She could imagine. She had been imagining for 22 years. That was the problem. The imagining was all she had, and the imagining was nothing like the reality, and the gap between them was growing wider with every passing hour, and nobody seemed to notice that the bride was standing at the edge of it, looking down. 2 days before the wedding, the family traveled to Thornbury. The carriage ride was 4 hours long, the same as always. Margaret coached. Philip calculated. Eleonora sat between them and watched England pass the window in shades of gray and brown, the color leached out of the landscape by winter, everything stripped and bare and exposed, and she thought about the girl who had made this journey at 7 years old, the girl who had clutched a miniature portrait, and wondered if the boy in it would be kind. The boy had not been kind. The boy had not been unkind. The boy had been nothing, absent, a placeholder, in a life she had been building alone, filling in the spaces where a partner should have been, with imagination and hope and the stubborn, exhausting belief that if she were good enough, patient enough, prepared enough, the placeholder would eventually become a person. The carriage arrived at Thornbury Hall. The staff lined up to greet them. Cedric was standing at the door. Eleonora stepped out of the carriage and looked at the man she was going to marry in 2 days, and something about the way the light fell on his face, or the way he was standing, or the particular quality of his expression, told her something she had been refusing to know. He did not want this either. The knowledge landed in her chest, with the quiet finality of a door closing. Not a slam, a click, the sound of a lock engaging. She looked at his face, and saw her own reluctance reflected back at her, and it was not comforting. It was devastating, because if he did not want her, then all of it, every lesson, every fitting, every year of preparation, every carefully constructed version of herself she had built to be worthy of this moment, all of it was for nothing. She was not even an unwilling bride. She was an unnecessary one. "Eleonora," he said. 2 syllables. "Welcome to Thornbury." "Thank you, Cedric." They shook hands. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man completing a transaction. She smiled, the Duchess smile, perfect, warm, hollow as a bell. Thornbury Hall had 47 rooms. Eleonora knew this because Mrs. Crawley had drilled the number into her head during the months of domestic training, along with the number of fireplaces, 23, the number of staff, 112, and the approximate annual cost of heating, which was a figure so large that Eleonora had assumed Mrs. Crawley was joking, until she saw the woman's expression and realized that Mrs. Crawley had never joked about anything in her life. 47 rooms, and Eleonora felt trapped in every single one of them. The Ashford family had been installed in the north wing, as Cedric's letter had promised. 3 bedrooms, a sitting room, and a private bathroom with copper fixtures that Margaret touched reverently, as though copper pipes were evidence of divine favor. Eleonora's room overlooked a section of the garden she had not seen before. A walled area with a fountain in the center that was not running, the water frozen in the December cold, the basin filled with dead leaves, and the particular stillness of things that have been abandoned but not removed. She unpacked her things. She placed the miniature portrait on the nightstand, because she always placed the miniature portrait on the nightstand, and the ritual had become so automatic that she did not question it until she was already setting it down, and her hand paused, hovering, and she looked at the painted face of the boy, who had been 11 years old for 17 years, and thought, "I do not need you anymore. I am in his house. I can see the real one." She put the portrait down anyway. Habits are the last things to die. They outlive intention, outlive desire, outlive even the person who formed them. They continue, because continuing is what they do. Dinner that first evening was formal. The long dining table at Thornbury Hall could seat 30, but tonight there were only 7. Cedric at the head, Eleonora to his right, Philip and Margaret opposite each other, and 3 members of Cedric's extended family, who had arrived early for the wedding. An aunt, named Lady Helen Hale, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, who examined Eleonora with the intensity of a jeweler evaluating a stone. A cousin named Frederick, who was 25 and drunk before the soup arrived, and Frederick's wife, a quiet woman named Catherine, who spent the entire meal looking at her plate, as though the pattern on the china were more interesting than anything anyone was saying. Eleonora watched Catherine, with the recognition of someone seeing their own future, the quiet wife at the quiet end of the table, decorative and undemanding, present in the room and absent from the conversation, existing in the margins of a life centered on someone else. "You are very quiet, Lady Eleonora," Lady Helen said from across the table, her voice carrying the particular sharpness of a woman who has spent 60 years observing other women and has decided that most of them are performing. "I expected more conversation from my nephews intended. I prefer to listen," Eleonora said. "Listening is a fine quality in a servant. A duchess requires more." The table went silent. Philip's fork stopped moving. Margaret's smile tightened by a fraction. Cedric, at the head of the table, looked up from his plate with the expression of a man who has just heard a sound he was hoping to avoid. "Aunt Helen," Cedric said, "Eleonora is our guest. She is not a guest. She is about to become family. I am treating her as family. Family tells the truth." Eleonora looked at Lady Helen and felt something unexpected. Not offense, not embarrassment, something closer to gratitude, because Lady Helen, for all her sharpness, was the first person in 22 years to speak to Eleonora as though she were a person with agency, rather than an item on a schedule. The criticism assumed that Eleonora could do better. That assumption, however roughly delivered, contained more respect than all the years of gentle handling she had received from parents who believed she was fragile, and a fiancé who believed she was furniture. "You are right," Eleonora said. "A duchess requires more. I am still learning what that means." Lady Helen looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. It was a small nod, barely perceptible, but Eleonora caught it and filed it away with the other small things she had been collecting her entire life, the tiny, barely visible moments that together formed a picture of who she might become if anyone ever gave her the space to find out. After dinner, Cedric asked Eleonora to walk with him. This was unusual. In 12 years of visits, Cedric had never requested her company voluntarily. Their interactions had always been arranged by others, scheduled and supervised and contained within the rigid framework of the contract. They walked through the long gallery, a corridor lined with portraits of Hale ancestors dating back 400 years. The paintings watched them pass with the flat, evaluating stares of people who had lived and died and been reduced to oil on canvas, their entire existences compressed into a single expression, chosen by a painter who had probably never met them. "I wanted to speak to you," Cedric said, "before the day." Eleonora's heart did something she did not expect. It accelerated, not with fear, not with anticipation, but with the specific alertness of an animal that has heard a sound in the dark and is deciding whether to run toward it or away. Of course. They walked in silence for several paces. The gallery was cold. Their footsteps echoed on the stone floor. "I want you to know," Cedric said, and then stopped. Not stopped walking, stopped speaking. The words hit a wall inside him and fell. Eleonora waited. She was exceptional at waiting. She had been practicing for 22 years. "I want you to know that I intend to be a good husband." The sentence landed in the air between them and lay there, flat and colorless, like a leaf that has fallen from a tree that died months ago. He intended to be a good husband, the way one intends to pay a bill. It was a statement of obligation, not affection. A promise to perform a role, not to inhabit a life. "Thank you, Cedric. I know this arrangement was not of your choosing." She looked at him. He was staring straight ahead, at the far end of the gallery, at the wall where the portraits ended and the stone was bare. "Was it of yours?" The question came out before she could catch it. It escaped her like a bird from a cage she had left open by accident, and it flew into the space between them and hovered there. And for 1 second, less than a second, a fraction of time so small it barely existed, something crossed Cedric's face. Something real. Something honest. Something that looked like the answer to every question she had never dared to ask. Then it was gone. The mask returned. The polite, distant expression she had been studying since she was 7 slid back into place, and Cedric was once again the man in the portrait on her nightstand, flat and painted and unreachable. "We will make the best of it," he said. "Make the best of it." The phrase, of prisoners and castaways. The language of people who have accepted that their circumstances will not change, and have decided to survive them rather than challenge them. "Yes," Eleonora said, "we will." They reached the end of the gallery. Cedric wished her good night. She wished him good night. They parted at the foot of the staircase, and Eleonora climbed the stairs to the north wing, and walked to her room, and closed the door, and leaned against it, and stood there in the dark for a long time, breathing, just breathing, feeling her lungs fill and empty, the most basic, involuntary act of being alive, the one thing no contract could control. "We will make the best of it." She pressed her forehead against the door and whispered into the wood, "I do not want the best of it. I want my own life." The door did not respond. Doors never do. But the words were out now, spoken into the cold air of a house she did not love, and they existed, and they were true. And for the first time in 22 years, Eleonora Ashford had said something honest, and meant every syllable. She went to bed. She did not sleep. The next morning, the day before the wedding, Thornbury Hall transformed. Staff that Eleonora had not seen during previous visits emerged from corners and corridors and outbuildings, carrying flowers and linens and equipment, with the coordinated urgency of an army preparing for a siege. The chapel, which was connected to the main house by a covered walkway, was being dressed in white roses, thousands of them. The scent was overwhelming, sweet and thick and funereal, and Eleonora walked through the chapel doors and felt the smell hit her like a physical thing, a wall of fragrance that made her eyes water and her stomach clench. "Beautiful, is it not?" Margaret said beside her, surveying the chapel with the satisfied expression of a general examining a battlefield that has been prepared to her specifications. "It is a great many roses. 1,200. I counted the order myself." Eleonora looked at the altar. Tomorrow she would stand there. Tomorrow she would say words that would bind her to the man in the gallery who intended to be a good husband, the way one intends to be punctual. Tomorrow the door would close, and the life she had been walking toward since birth would begin. And the girl who had whispered into a door in the dark would disappear into the title, and the house, and the 47 rooms, and the 1,200 roses. She walked up the aisle. Alone. Her footsteps echoed on the stone. The white roses lined the pews like spectators, already in their seats, silent and identical, and waiting. She reached the altar, and stood where she would stand tomorrow. She looked back down the aisle. It was the longest walk she had ever seen, not in distance, in meaning. Every step of that aisle was a year of her life. The entrance was her birth. The altar was her ending. The space between was everything she had been, and everything she would never get to be. "Eleonora, are you all right?" Margaret, standing at the chapel door, watching her daughter standing at the altar alone, and not understanding, not even slightly, that she was watching someone say goodbye. "I am fine, Mama. I am just looking." She turned away from the aisle and walked toward the side door and stepped out into the cold December air and breathed it in, sharp and clean and tasting of nothing, and she stood there in the garden with the frozen fountain and the dead leaves and thought about Charlotte, about curtains, about the difference between fighting with someone and agreeing with no one. She thought about the question Charlotte had asked on the gray path between the bare hedgerows. "Are you going to be a very good Eleonora?" She did not know the answer. She had never known the answer. The question assumed that there was an Eleonora separate from the contract and the training and the 22 years of preparation, a core self that existed independently of all the layers that had been applied to it, and she was not sure that was true. She was not sure there was anything under the Duchess. She was not sure she had not been hollowed out so thoroughly by the performance that the performance was all that remained. The thought terrified her, not in the way that falling terrifies, or fire, or violence, in the way that emptiness terrifies. The fear of reaching inside yourself and finding nothing there. No opinions, no desires, no preferences, no self, just a well-mannered chair. She went back inside. She smiled. She attended the rehearsal dinner, where Cedric sat at the head of the table and made a toast that was polite and correct, and contained not a single word that suggested he was marrying a person he cared about, rather than a clause in a contract. "To tomorrow," he said, "and to a union that honors both our families." The guests raised their glasses. Eleonora raised hers. The wine was red and expensive and tasted of nothing, and she drank it and smiled, and felt the last hours of her old life draining away like water from a cracked vessel. After dinner, she found herself alone in the library. The room was vast, 2 stories of shelves filled with books that smelled of leather and dust, and the particular staleness of knowledge that has been collected but never consumed. She pulled a volume down at random. Poetry. She opened it to a page near the middle and read a line that stopped her breathing. The line was about a caged bird that had forgotten what the sky looked like, not because the sky had changed, but because the bird had stopped looking up. She closed the book. She put it back on the shelf. She pressed her palm flat against the spine and held it there, as though the words inside could transfer through her skin and into her blood and give her something she needed, some chemical of courage, some formula for defiance. The book was cold against her hand. Everything in Thornbury Hall was cold. She went upstairs. She passed the wardrobe where the dress was hanging. She opened the door and looked at it. The ivory silk gleamed in the low light, spectral and patient, a garment that had been designed to make her disappear into someone else. She closed the wardrobe. She sat on the bed. She picked up the miniature portrait from the nightstand and held it in both hands and looked at the painted face of the boy she had been promised to since birth. And she said, very quietly, to no one, to everyone, to the empty room, and the cold house, and the frozen fountain, and the 1,200 roses waiting in the chapel, I do not think you are a bad man, Cedric. I think you are a man who never learned to want anything, and I am a woman who was never allowed to. And tomorrow we are going to stand in that chapel and make promises that neither of us means, and call it duty, and the duty will crush us both. She put the portrait face down on the nightstand. It was the first time in 17 years that she had not placed it upright. She lay down. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Tomorrow was coming. It had been coming for 22 years. And Eleonora Ashford, who had been built to receive it, was cracking. The morning of the 14th of December arrived the way all dreaded mornings arrive. Too fast and not fast enough. Eleonora opened her eyes at 5 and found the room still dark, the kind of thick winter darkness that feels permanent, as though the sun has reviewed the day's schedule and decided not to participate. She lay in bed and listened to her own heartbeat. It was steady. This surprised her. She had expected racing, pounding, the desperate rhythm of a trapped animal. Instead, her heart beat with the calm, even pace of a clock in an empty room. Tick, 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 counting down to something it had been calibrated for since the moment it first started beating. She rose. She washed. She sat at the vanity and brushed her hair with mechanical strokes. 100, the number her mother had prescribed since childhood, and each stroke pulled through the length of her hair with a gentle resistance that she focused on, because focusing on small, physical sensations was easier than focusing on the fact that in 7 hours she would cease to be Eleonora Ashford and become the Duchess of Thornbury, and the distinction between those two identities was so vast and so final that thinking about it produced a kind of vertigo, a spinning sensation that started behind her eyes and spread outward until the whole room seemed to tilt. She put the brush down. She gripped the edge of the vanity. She breathed. Margaret arrived at 7, with a tray of tea and toast, and the barely contained energy of a woman who has been waiting for this day since the brandy and contracts evening, 22 years ago. She was already dressed, already made up, already assembled into the perfect image of a mother of the bride, her hair pinned in an elaborate arrangement that must have taken an hour, and her eyes bright with the particular intensity of someone for whom this day represents the culmination of a life's work. "Good morning, darling. How did you sleep?" "Beautifully," Eleonora said. She had not slept at all. She had lain in the dark for 6 hours and stared at the ceiling and counted the cracks in the plaster and thought about the walk down the aisle and the words she would say and the hand she would take and the life she would enter, and each thought had produced another thought, and each thought had produced another, an endless chain of considerations that led, every single time, back to the same place, A girl, standing at a window, watching the future approach like weather she could not outrun. Eat your toast. You will need the energy. It is going to be a long day. Eleonora ate the toast. It tasted like nothing. Everything tasted like nothing this morning. The tea was hot and flavorless. The marmalade was sweet and empty. Even the light coming through the window, which was finally arriving in thin, gray strips, seemed diluted, as though the world itself was holding back, reserving its full brightness for some other day, some other bride, some other morning that deserved it more. The preparations began at 8. A woman named Rose, who had been hired from London specifically for the occasion, arrived to do Eleonora's hair and cosmetics. Rose was 30, efficient, and possessed of the professional cheerfulness of someone who makes brides look beautiful for a living, and has learned that the morning of a wedding is not the time for honest conversation. "You have lovely hair," Rose said, sectioning it with practiced fingers. "Thick, cooperative." Cooperative. The word landed on Eleonora like a small, precise stone. Her hair was cooperative. Her posture was cooperative. Her smile was cooperative. Every part of her had been trained to cooperate, to yield, to accommodate the shape imposed on it by stronger hands, and even her hair, her dead, insensible hair, was being praised for its willingness to comply. "Thank you," she said. Rose pinned and curled and smoothed and sprayed, and Eleonora watched herself transform in the mirror, the way you watch a time-lapse of a building being constructed. Impersonal, incremental, inevitable. Layer by layer, the face she knew was replaced by a face she recognized only from dress rehearsals and fitting room mirrors. The Duchess face, the bride face. The face of a woman who was not a woman but a product, assembled and polished and packaged for delivery. Margaret supervised. She stood behind Eleonora's chair and watched every pin and curl with the focused attention of a quality control inspector on a production line. Occasionally, she offered instructions. The curl should fall here. More color on the cheeks. The eyes need to be softer. Softer. As though Eleonora's eyes were too hard, too honest, too likely to reveal something the dress and the hair and the makeup were designed to conceal. At 10, the dress came out. Margaret and Rose lifted it from the wardrobe with the combined reverence and caution of archaeologists handling an artifact. The ivory silk caught the weak morning light and shimmered, and Eleonora looked at it and felt a sensation she could only describe as recognition. Not the recognition of seeing something familiar, the recognition of seeing something final. The dress was the last step. Once it was on, the transformation would be complete, and the girl who had written lists in notebooks and pulled weeds in gardens and pressed her forehead against doors in the dark would be sealed inside layers of silk and lace and expectation, and she was not sure she would be able to breathe in there. "Step in, darling." She stepped in. Rose held the bodice, while Margaret began the buttons. 32 of them, starting at the base of her spine and climbing to the nape of her neck, each one a small click of closure, a tiny, definitive sound that marked another inch of skin covered, another degree of freedom removed. Click, 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 22 of them, one for each ear. Click, 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 click. 32 buttons, and with the last one, Eleonora felt the dress tighten around her ribcage, like a corset made of decisions she had not made, and she stood in front of the full-length mirror and looked at the woman who looked back, and the woman was a duchess. The veil was pinned. The sapphire necklace was clasped around her neck, cold against her collarbone, Cedric's gift, beautiful and lonely. The shoes were placed on her feet, satin, ivory, with heels that added 2 inches to her height and removed approximately 50% of her stability. Perfect, Margaret breathed. Her eyes were wet. Her hands were clasped. She looked at Eleonora the way a sculptor looks at a finished statue, with the particular pride of someone who has taken raw material and shaped it into something they consider beautiful. Eleonora looked at herself. Perfect. The word echoed in the cold room, like a coin dropped in an empty well. Perfect, she repeated. The morning continued. Relatives arrived at her door in waves, each one entering to admire the bride and offer congratulations that sounded rehearsed because they were. Aunt Millicent, who was Margaret's sister, and who smelled of lavender and unwanted advice. Uncle Richard, who was Philip's brother, and who was already red-faced from the port he had been drinking since breakfast. Cousins, whose names Eleonora could not remember, and whose faces blurred into a single composite expression of obligatory enthusiasm. Stunning. Radiant. Cedric is a lucky man. Each compliment was a small brick added to a wall between Eleonora and the truth, and by the time the last relative had departed, the wall was high enough that she could no longer see over it. At 11:30, Philip came to collect her. He was wearing his best coat, the one he reserved for occasions of maximum importance, and his face carried the expression of a man who is simultaneously proud and terrified, though the terror was not about his daughter's happiness. The terror was about the debts. The terror was always about the debts. Even today, on the morning of the event he had engineered 2 decades ago, Philip Ashford was calculating, and the calculations were not kind. "You look beautiful, Eleonora." "Thank you, Papa." He offered his arm. She took it. His sleeve was rough beneath her gloved fingers, and she could feel his pulse through the fabric, faster than it should have been, the heartbeat of a man who has gambled everything on a single hand and is about to find out whether the cards are in his favor. They walked to the chapel. The covered walkway between the house and the chapel was 30 yards long, and Eleonora walked it with her hand on her father's arm, and her eyes forward, and her breathing controlled, and her 32 buttons tight against her spine, and every step was a beat, every beat was a year, and the years were running out. The chapel doors were closed. Behind them, she could hear the murmur of 400 guests, the rustling of expensive clothing, the low, continuous hum of expectation. The sound was enormous and anonymous, a collective noise produced by people who had come to witness the fulfillment of a contract they did not fully understand, between 2 people they did not fully know, in a ceremony they would describe to their friends over dinner next week as either beautiful or tedious, depending on their proximity to the free champagne. "Are you ready?" Philip asked. Eleonora looked at the chapel doors. They were oak, heavy, old. They had been opening and closing for 300 years, admitting generations of hails to weddings and funerals, and christenings, the full cycle of aristocratic life compressed into a single set of hinges. "Yes, Papa." The doors opened. 1,200 white roses, 400 guests, 3 bishops in ceremonial vestments, candles burning in the chandeliers, their flames steady and untroubled, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. And at the far end of the aisle, standing at the altar with his hands at his sides and his chin raised and his expression locked into a configuration that could have been resolve or could have been resignation, stood Cedric. The music began. An organ piece that Margaret had selected after auditioning 7 different compositions and rejecting 6 of them for reasons ranging from too somber to insufficiently ducal. The chosen piece was grand and swelling, and designed to make the bride's entrance feel significant, and it succeeded, because significance was the one thing this occasion did not lack. Eleonora stepped onto the aisle. Every head turned. 400 faces swiveled toward her with the synchronized precision of a flock of birds changing direction. She felt their eyes on her like physical weight, hundreds of gazes landing on the ivory silk and the Belgian lace and the sapphire necklace and the careful, cooperative hair, and she walked toward the altar with steps she had rehearsed 1,000 times, smooth and even, and measured. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm of a woman marching toward a life she had been promised to since birth. She focused on her bouquet, white roses, matching the chapel. The stems were wrapped in silk ribbon, and she gripped them tight enough that her knuckles whitened beneath her gloves, and she thought, hold on. Just hold on. 30 more steps. 20. 10. She reached the altar. Cedric turned to face her. Their eyes met. And for the second time in 2 days, she saw it. The thing behind his mask. The thing he carried inside the title, and the obligation, and the polite, careful composure. It was not love. It was not hatred. It was something between those extremes. Something shapeless, and desperate, and deeply, fundamentally tired. He was tired. The Duke of Thornbury, 23 years old, owner of 47 rooms and 10,000 acres, and a name that would outlast them both, was standing at the altar of his own wedding, and he was tired, in a way that sleep could not fix, and duty could not cure, and the 400 people watching him could not begin to understand. The bishop opened his book. The ceremony began. Eleonora stood beside Cedric and listened to words that had been spoken in this chapel for 3 centuries, words about union and fidelity, and the joining of 2 lives in the sight of God and the congregation, and she felt each word land on her like a drop of rain, small and cold and accumulating. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. The bishop's voice was deep and ceremonial, the voice of a man who has performed this ritual so many times that the words have been worn smooth by repetition, like stones in a riverbed. He spoke about the sanctity of marriage, about the bond between husband and wife, about the responsibility of those present to support and uphold the union being formed. Eleonora listened. She gripped her bouquet. She kept her eyes forward. The bishop turned to Cedric. Do you, Cedric George Hale, Duke of Thornbury, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Cedric opened his mouth, and the chapel held its breath. 400 people, 1,200 roses, 3 bishops, and a bride in 32 buttons waited for a single word that had been predetermined by a contract signed 22 years ago over brandy and gambling debts in a study where a baby girl was screaming in the room above. Cedric's mouth was open. The word should have come out. It should have been automatic. 2 letters, 1 syllable, the simplest, smallest, most rehearsed word in the English language. It did not come. The silence extended. 1 second, 2, 3. Eleonora looked at him. Cedric's jaw was locked. His hands were at his sides, clenched into fists, and his eyes were not on her. They were on a point, somewhere behind her, above her, beyond her, fixed on something that nobody else in the chapel could see. 4 seconds. 5. The bishop shifted. The congregation stirred. Margaret, in the front pew, leaned forward with an expression that was not yet alarm, but was rapidly approaching it. Cedric closed his mouth. He opened it again. I cannot do this. The words fell into the chapel like stones into still water. They hit the surface, and the ripples spread outward, through the pews, through the congregation, through 400 carefully dressed bodies that had come expecting a wedding and were receiving something else entirely. I cannot marry you, Eleonora. She heard the words. She processed the words. Her brain received them and decoded them and delivered their meaning to the rest of her body. And the rest of her body did not react, because the rest of her body had been trained for 22 years to absorb information without visible response, to receive blows without flinching, to stand in the center of catastrophe and maintain the posture and the smile and the 32 buttons. Her bouquet was tilting left. That was the thought her mind produced, not, my life is ending, not, 22 years of preparation have just been demolished in a single sentence, not even, why. Her mind, in the moment of its greatest crisis, focused on the fact that her bouquet, her carefully arranged, silk-ribboned white rose bouquet, was listing slightly to the left, and she adjusted it, straightened it, brought it back to center. The chapel erupted. The sound that 400 people make when the world does something they did not expect is not a gasp. It is not a scream. It is something between those things, a collective inhalation, followed by a murmur that builds and builds until it becomes a wall of noise, voices overlapping and climbing and feeding on each other, each person's shock amplifying the shock of the person beside them, until the entire chapel vibrated with the frequency of disbelief. Cedric stood at the altar and let the noise wash over him with the expression of a man who has jumped from a height and is still falling, still suspended between the ledge and the ground, still in the airless space where consequences have not yet arrived. "I am sorry," he said. He was speaking to Eleonora, but his voice carried in the chapel's acoustics, reaching every corner, every pew, every horrified face. "I am sorry. I cannot do this. There is someone else. Someone else." Two words that detonated in the chapel like a second explosion, bigger than the first, because the first had been a refusal, and refusals can be explained, can be retracted, can be attributed to cold feet or momentary panic. But someone else was not a refusal. It was a replacement. It meant that Cedric had not simply decided he could not marry Eleonora. He had decided he wanted to marry someone who was not Eleonora. The distinction was a knife, and it cut with surgical precision. Eleonora stood at the altar and held her bouquet, and looked at the man she had been promised to for 22 years, and felt the floor beneath her shift, not physically, not literally, but in the deeper sense, the tectonic sense, the sense in which the ground you have been standing on your entire life reveals itself to be not solid earth, but a thin crust, over something molten, and the crust has cracked, and you are falling. She did not fall. She stood. She stood because standing was what she had been built to do. 22 years of training, of deportment lessons and curtsy practice, and the relentless, grinding discipline of being shaped into a duchess, all of it coalesced in this single moment into its only useful function, keeping Eleonora Ashford upright at the altar, while the man she was supposed to marry told 400 people that he preferred someone else. The bishop had stopped speaking, the book in his hands hung open and useless, a script interrupted by improvisation. He looked at Cedric with the bewildered expression of a man who has performed this ceremony hundreds of times and has never, not once, encountered a groom who deviated from the text. Margaret was on her feet. She had risen from the front pew with the abrupt, mechanical motion of a puppet jerked upright by its strings, and her face was a color that Eleonora had never seen on a human being, a shade somewhere between white and gray that suggested blood had not just drained from her face, but had evacuated entirely, retreating to some interior bunker to await further instructions. Philip had not moved. He sat in the front pew with his hands on his knees and his mouth open and his eyes fixed on Cedric with an expression that Eleonora recognized because she had seen it before, in the study, over the ledger, when the numbers refused to add up. It was the expression of a man watching his calculations collapse. "Cedric." Margaret's voice cut through the chapel noise with the particular sharpness of a woman who has spent her entire life maintaining control and is watching it disintegrate. "Cedric, what are you doing?" "I am being honest, Lady Ashford. For the first time in my life, I am being honest. This is not honesty. This is madness. You have a contract. You have an obligation. I had a contract. My father had an obligation. I am not my father." The chapel noise surged again, a wave of voices cresting and breaking, and Eleonora stood in the center of it and felt the sound move through her like weather, impersonal and vast and completely indifferent to her existence. Her bouquet was still centered. She had that. In the middle of the annihilation of every plan that had ever been made for her, she had a level bouquet. Cedric turned to her. His face was pale and wrecked and honest in a way she had never seen, stripped of every layer of politeness and propriety that had defined every interaction they had ever had. He looked like a man who had been skinned, raw and exposed, and unable to hide anything. "Eleonora, I am sorry. You deserved better than this. You deserved better than all of this." She looked at him. The noise faded. The 400 guests faded. The roses and the candles and the bishops faded. There was only his face and her face, and the space between them, which had always been vast and was now infinite. "Who is she?" Eleonora asked. The question was quiet, controlled. 3 words delivered with the precision of a surgeon making an incision, and the precision cost her everything she had left, every reserve of composure, every last gram of the discipline that had been poured into her since birth. Her name is Vivienne. Vivienne. The name she had been hearing in whispers for months. The name her mother had dismissed with a flick of her wrist. The name on the letter she had found in Cedric's coat pocket at dinner. The letter she had read 2 lines of, before putting back and smoothing the fabric, and sitting through 4 courses of small talk with shaking hands. Vivian. She had known. Some part of her had known since that dinner. The knowledge had lived in the narrow space between what she allowed herself to think and what she allowed herself to feel, buried beneath layers of obedience and denial, and the desperate, exhausting hope that if she did not acknowledge the truth would have the decency to go away. The truth had not gone away. The truth had walked into a chapel and spoken its name in front of 400 witnesses. "I see," Eleonora said. 2 words. "I see." The smallest possible response to the largest possible betrayal. She said them because there was nothing else to say that would not crack her open in front of 400 people, and she had already been cracked open enough for one day, and the cracks were spreading, and if she said one more honest thing, if she allowed one more real emotion to escape the structure that held her together, the whole edifice would collapse, and she would be standing at the altar in pieces, and she could not afford to be in pieces. Not here. Not now, not in front of them. She turned. She faced the aisle. 400 faces stared back at her, a sea of expressions ranging from horror to fascination to the particular eager alertness of people who are witnessing something they will dine out on for years. She looked at them, all of them, and she walked. She walked down the aisle. The same aisle she had walked up minutes earlier, on her father's arm, to the sound of organ music and the weight of 400 expectations. She walked it alone now, and there was no music, only the sound of her heels on stone and the rustle of ivory silk and the murmur of voices that fell silent as she passed, each row of guests going quiet as she moved through them, as though her presence was a wave that extinguished sound. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked with the same measured, rehearsed steps she had been taught since childhood. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Because if she changed the rhythm, if she accelerated, if she gave any indication that she was fleeing rather than departing, the composure would break, and the composure was the only thing keeping her alive. She reached the chapel doors. She walked through them. The cold December air hit her like a wall. It wrapped around her bare shoulders and seeped through the ivory silk and found the skin beneath, and the shock of it was so sharp and so real that it accomplished what 400 staring faces and a broken engagement could not. It made her feel something. She felt cold. That was it. That was all. In the wreckage of everything, the only thing her body was willing to acknowledge was temperature. The rest, the humiliation, the betrayal, the 22 years of wasted preparation, was somewhere behind a door that her mind had closed and locked and was refusing to open. She walked to the walled garden, the one with the frozen fountain and the dead leaves. She stood in the center of it, in her wedding dress, in the December cold, with her bouquet still in her hands, and her veil still pinned, and her 32 buttons still fastened, and she stood there, because standing was what she knew how to do. Voices came from the chapel, raised voices. Margaret's sharp soprano cutting through the deeper tones of Philip's baritone and the bishop's uncertain bass. The sounds of a family unraveling in a holy place. Arguments and accusations bouncing off stone walls and stained glass windows. And Eleonora heard all of it, and none of it, because her hearing, like her feeling, had retreated behind the door that her mind had locked. She looked at the frozen fountain. The ice was gray and still and absolute. Nothing moved beneath it. Nothing could. She set the bouquet down on the edge of the fountain basin. The white roses lay against the gray stone, and they looked like something placed on a grave. She sat down beside them. The cold stone soaked through the ivory silk. She could feel it against her legs, sharp and real, the one sensation that was getting through. She sat there for a long time. Eventually, footsteps. Not Margaret's, not Philip's. Heavier, slower. Someone approaching with the uncertain gait of a person who is not sure they should be approaching at all. Edward Blackwell appeared at the garden gate. He was Cedric's friend, the one she had met at the rehearsal dinner, the second son with the easy laugh and the sharp tongue. He was not laughing now. His face carried the particular expression of a man who has just watched his closest friend detonate his own life, and is not sure whether to applaud or intervene. Lady Eleonora. She looked at him. She did not speak, because speaking required energy she had already spent. "I brought your coat." He was holding it. Her traveling coat. the one she had worn in the carriage from Ashford Manor. He held it out, the way you hold something out to a wild animal, slowly, without sudden movements, with the understanding that the animal might bolt or bite, and either response would be entirely justified. She took the coat. She put it on over the wedding dress, which was absurd. A heavy wool traveling coat over 10,000 pounds of Belgian lace and ivory silk. And the absurdity of it was the first thing that pierced the numbness, the first crack in the wall her mind had built. He asked me to tell you that he is sorry. Eleonora looked at Edward. He told me himself. He wanted to tell you again. Once was sufficient. Edward stood at the garden gate and looked at her, sitting on the frozen fountain, in a wedding dress under a traveling coat, and his expression shifted from uncertainty to something quieter, something that looked like respect. For what it is worth, he said, I told him not to do it this way. I told him to speak to you privately, weeks ago, months ago. He should have told you the moment he understood what was happening. What was happening? He fell in love with someone else, and he was too much of a coward to tell you, until cowardice was no longer an option. Fell in love. The phrase landed on Eleonora like something dropped from a great height, and it broke against the frozen surface of her composure, and the pieces scattered, and she could not catch them. Cedric had fallen in love. The boy in the portrait, the man at the altar, the Duke who had walked 3 steps ahead of her in the garden and pointed at roses without turning around. That man had fallen in love with a woman named Vivienne, and the falling had been happening while Eleonora stood in fitting rooms and learned 8-course menus, and counted buttons, and practiced smiles, and built an entire life around the assumption that she would be received. He had been falling towards someone else, while she had been standing still, waiting for him, and the waiting had been the only thing she had ever done, and it had been for nothing. Please leave, she said. Edward left. Eleonora sat in the garden until the cold became unbearable, and then she sat in it a little longer, because the cold was honest, and honesty was in short supply today. When she finally stood, her legs were stiff, and her hands were numb, and the bouquet had frozen to the edge of the fountain, the water in the stems crystallizing in the December air, fixing the white roses in place, like a permanent memorial to a wedding that did not happen. She left the bouquet there. She went inside. She climbed the stairs to the north wing. She closed the door to her room. She stood in the center of the floor in a wedding dress, under a traveling coat, and looked at the miniature portrait on the nightstand, the one she had placed face down the night before, and she thought about all the mornings she had woken up and looked at that painted face, and told herself that it meant something, that the contract meant something, that the training and the preparation and the years of patient, obedient waiting meant something. It had meant nothing. She had been committed to a Duke since birth, and the Duke had chosen someone else, and the commitment had been as real as the portrait, two-dimensional, a surface, an image of a thing that was never actually there. She sat on the bed. She did not remove the dress. She was not ready to remove the dress. Removing the dress meant accepting that the wedding was over, and accepting that the wedding was over meant accepting that the life she had been built for was over, and she was not ready for that. Not yet. She needed to sit with it. She needed to let the weight of it settle around her, the way snow settles on a landscape, gradually, covering everything, changing the shape of the world one flake at a time. She sat there for a very long time. Nobody came to check on her. And in the chapel below, the 400 guests filed out into the December cold, and the 1,200 roses stood in their arrangements and wilted slowly, and the candles burned down to nothing, and the day that had been planned for 22 years ended with a girl in a wedding dress sitting alone in a room that was supposed to have been hers, in a house that was supposed to have been her home, in a life that had never, not for a single moment, been her own. The carriage ride home was the quietest 4 hours of Eleonora's life. Margaret sat in the corner of the carriage with her face turned toward the window and her gloved hands folded in her lap, and she did not speak, because speaking would have required acknowledging what had happened, and Margaret Ashford had spent her entire life perfecting the art of not acknowledging things. Philip sat opposite, staring at the floor with the blank, defeated expression of a man whose calculations have finally, irrevocably, terminally failed to add up. Eleonora sat between them in her traveling clothes. The wedding dress was packed in the box it had arrived in, stored in the luggage rack above, and every time the carriage hit a bump in the road, the box shifted slightly, and the sound of silk moving against cardboard was the only noise in the vehicle. She had changed out of the dress in the north wing bedroom, while Margaret stood in the hallway outside, unable to enter, unable to help with the 32 buttons because helping with the buttons would have meant touching the dress, and touching the dress would have meant feeling the fabric that had been constructed for a ceremony that had not occurred, and Margaret could not feel that. Not yet. Eleonora had unfastened the buttons herself, 32 of them, reaching behind her back with arms that ached from the position, fumbling with each tiny closure, each one clicking open with the same small sound it had made clicking shut, and each click was a reversal, a rewinding, a taking back of something that had never been given. The dress had pooled at her feet like a shed skin. She had stepped out of it. She had stood in her undergarments in the cold room and looked at the ivory silk on the floor and thought, that is what 22 years of preparation looks like when it has been abandoned by its purpose. It looks like a dress on a floor. It looks like nothing. She had dressed in her own clothes. She had removed the pins from her hair, one by one, dropping them on the vanity, with small metallic sounds that echoed in the empty room. She had counted them. 37 pins. She had not intended to count them. The counting had happened automatically, her mind seizing on the small, measurable task, because the large, unmeasurable reality was too vast to process. 37 pins, 32 buttons, one necklace, one veil, one pair of satin shoes, the components of a bride disassembled and returned to their individual parts, each one a fragment of a whole that would never be assembled again. She had left the miniature portrait on the nightstand. Face down, she did not take it with her. For 17 years it had traveled with her, nightstand to nightstand, the constant companion of her sleeping hours. She left it in the north wing of Thornbury Hall like a thing outgrown, a relic of a belief she no longer held. The carriage arrived at Ashford Manor at 10 in the evening. The house was dark. The staff had not been expecting them back. A wedding was supposed to last for days, celebrations extending through the weekend, the bride installed in her new home, the parents returning in triumph. There was no triumph. There was Philip unlocking the front door with stiff fingers, and Margaret walking past him without a word, and Eleonora climbing the stairs to her bedroom, and closing the door, and standing in the dark, and listening to the house settle around her, the old familiar creaks and groans of wood and plaster, sounds she had been hearing her entire life, sounds that had always meant home, and that now meant something else. They meant, you are back where you started. She lit a candle. She sat at her desk. She opened her notebook. The list was there, minus the page she had torn out and burned. 2 entries remained. To be asked. What would I say if someone did? She stared at the words. They looked different now. Before the wedding, they had been hypothetical, abstract, the daydreams of a girl who wondered what freedom might feel like, without ever expecting to encounter it. Now they were real. Now the question was not theoretical. Someone had, in fact, asked. Not with words, and not with kindness, but the universe had asked Eleonora Ashford whether she wanted the life that had been designed for her, and the universe had answered on her behalf by removing it. She had not been freed. She had been discarded. The distinction mattered. Being freed meant someone had looked at her cage and decided she deserved the sky. Being discarded meant someone had looked at her and decided she was not worth the cage. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She did not sleep. The days that followed were a kind of weather. They arrived and departed without Eleonora's participation, gray and featureless, and indistinguishable from each other, a procession of hours that she moved through with the mechanical detachment of a person walking in their sleep. Margaret took to her room. The door closed on the evening they returned, and did not open for 3 days, and when it finally did, the woman who emerged was diminished, smaller somehow, as though the collapse of her plans had physically reduced her, compressing her into a denser, harder version of herself that took up less space and contained more bitterness. She did not blame Cedric. She blamed Eleonora. She did not say this directly. Margaret never said anything directly, but the blame was there, in the angle of her gaze when she looked at her daughter, in the particular tightness of her mouth when Eleonora entered a room, in the small, cutting observations she delivered with the precision of a woman who has been studying her target for 22 years and knows exactly where the weak points are. Perhaps if you had been more engaging during the visits. A man needs stimulation, Eleonora. Conversation. Warmth. Your father's mother was a brilliant conversationalist. It is a shame the gift did not pass to you. Each observation landed on Eleonora like a small, accurate stone, and she absorbed them the way she had absorbed everything her entire life, silently, without visible reaction, storing them in the place where all the other small stones had accumulated over the years, a cairn of criticism that had grown so large it had its own gravity. Philip retreated to the study, the door locked. The sound of bottles clinked behind it, at intervals that grew shorter as the days passed. The debts, which the contract had held at bay, were resurfacing with the patient inevitability of water finding its level. The Hale family's solicitor had sent a letter within 48 hours of the failed wedding, a precisely worded document that outlined the financial consequences of the broken engagement with the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing an amputation. The contract was void. The debts were restored. The interest had accumulated for 22 years. The total was a number so large that when Philip saw it, he poured a glass of brandy and sat in his chair and did not move for 6 hours. Eleonora learned about the financial situation from the household staff, who discussed it in the kitchen, in voices they thought were too low to carry through the service door, but were not. She stood in the hallway and listened to the cook and the housekeeper debate whether the family would be forced to sell the manor, and the conversation was conducted with the particular blend of concern and excitement that characterizes people who are worried about their employers, but also slightly thrilled by the drama. The master has not eaten in 2 days. The mistress threw a vase at the wall this morning, the blue one from the mantel. The girl has not come downstairs. The girl, that was Eleonora. Reduced from Lady Eleonora, to the Ashford girl, to the girl, each iteration stripping another layer of identity, another increment of status, until she was nothing but a pronoun and a noun, a generic reference to a person, who had once been promised to a duke, and was now something else. She was not sure what she was now. The contract had defined her for so long that its absence left a gap she could not fill. She had been a future duchess. She was not a future duchess. The subtraction left a remainder she could not calculate, a quantity that existed but had no name. On the 4th day, she came downstairs. She walked through the house and noticed things she had not noticed before, or had noticed and chosen not to examine. The threadbare patches on the carpets that Margaret had covered with furniture, the water stain on the ceiling of the dining room that Philip had been meaning to repair for 3 years, the general atmosphere of genteel deterioration that pervaded every room, the slow, visible decay of a house that was spending more than it earned, and had been doing so for longer than Eleonora had been alive. The house was broke. The family was broke. The brokenness had been there all along, concealed behind the wedding preparations and the annual visits and the grand, expensive performance of suitability that had consumed every resource the Ashford family had. Eleonora stood in the dining room and looked at the water stain on the ceiling and thought about how much money had been spent on orchids and ivory silk and gold-lettered invitations, and how that money was gone, and the orchids were dead, and the silk was in a box in her wardrobe, and the invitations were in the hands of 400 people, who were now using them as conversation pieces, proof of their proximity to the scandal of the season. Charlotte came on the 5th day. She arrived without announcement, walking up the drive in a heavy coat, with her cheeks red from the cold, and her expression set in the particular configuration of a woman who has heard the news and has come not to discuss it, but to be present, which was a distinction Eleonora appreciated more than she could express. They sat in the morning room. Charlotte did not ask how Eleonora was feeling. She did not offer advice. She did not say, "I told you so," although she had every right to, because Charlotte had asked the questions nobody else had asked, and had seen the answers nobody else had seen. She sat beside Eleonora and held her hand, and said nothing for 20 minutes, and the silence was the kindest thing anyone had given Eleonora since the chapel. "The newspapers are writing about it," Charlotte said eventually. "I imagined they would." "They are not kind." "I did not imagine they would be." Charlotte squeezed her hand. "George says it is the talk of every drawing room in the county. He says people are calling Cedric a villain. He is not a villain." Charlotte looked at her with the surprised, evaluating expression of someone who has just discovered that the person they thought they knew is someone else entirely. You are defending him? I am not defending him. I am being accurate. He is not a villain. He is a man who chose someone else. Choosing someone else is not villainy. It is preference. The villainy was the contract. The villainy was two men deciding the fate of a girl before she could speak, and everyone agreeing that this was acceptable because it happened in a study rather than a marketplace. The words came out of Eleonora with a force that surprised them both. They had been building behind the door her mind had locked on the morning of the wedding, accumulating pressure, and now the door had cracked and the words were coming through, and they were not polite, and they were not measured, and they were not the words of a well-mannered chair. They were the words of a person. Charlotte stared at her. Then she smiled. It was not a sympathetic smile or a pitying smile. It was the smile of someone who has been waiting a very long time to see something and has finally seen it. "There you are," Charlotte said. "I have been looking for you for years." Eleonora did not smile back. She was not ready to smile. But she felt something shift inside her. A realignment of internal structures, the first movement of a machine that had been locked in position for 22 years and was beginning, slowly, painfully, to turn. The newspapers arrived on the 6th day. Margaret brought them to the breakfast table with the grim determination of a person administering medicine, and she spread them out on the tablecloth, and Eleonora read them while eating toast that she did not taste. The coverage was extensive. The scandal of the Duke of Thornbury's broken engagement had reached London within hours, carried by the 400 guests who had scattered from Thornbury Chapel to their respective homes and social circles, and had distributed the story with the efficiency of a postal service dedicated exclusively to humiliation. The articles varied in tone, but agreed on the narrative. The Duke had abandoned his intended at the altar for another woman. The intended was described as the unfortunate Lady Eleonora Ashford and the rejected bride, and, in one particularly vicious publication, the girl who was not enough. The girl who was not enough. Eleonora read the phrase and set the newspaper down and placed her palms flat on the table and breathed through a sensation that was not anger and not grief, but some unholy combination of both. A feeling that had teeth and heat and the particular, focused intensity of an emotion that has been compressed for too long and is about to expand. "They are cruel," Margaret said from across the table, and for the first time in days, her voice contained something other than blame. It contained fear. The fear of a mother who is watching her daughter be consumed by public opinion and cannot do anything to stop it, because public opinion is not a fire you can extinguish. It is a weather system. It goes where it goes. It does what it does. "They are accurate," Eleonora said. "I was not enough. That is what happened. I was prepared for 22 years, and I was not enough." "That is not true, Eleonora." "It is exactly true. And the reason it is true is not because I am deficient. It is because the preparation itself was deficient. You prepared me to be a duchess. You did not prepare me to be a person. And when a man was given the choice between a duchess and a person, he chose the person." Margaret's face did something complicated. The layers of blame and fear and self-pity that had been accumulating since the chapel shifted and rearranged, and for one brief second, Eleonora saw something underneath them, something raw and honest and frightened, the face of a woman who had spent her entire life building a structure that had just collapsed and was standing in the rubble trying to understand what had gone wrong. The second passed, the layers reformed. Margaret picked up her tea and drank it, and the conversation was over. But it had happened. The words had been spoken, and words, once spoken, cannot be unspoken, any more than water can be unspilled, or a bell can be unrung. They exist in the space between people, permanent and reverberating, and they change the shape of everything they touch. On the 7th day, Philip emerged from the study. He looked terrible. His face was gray. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands trembled when he reached for his coffee cup, and the trembling was not from cold or from age, but from the specific, targeted devastation of a man who has spent 3 decades running from financial ruin and has finally been caught. "We will need to sell the horses," he said. This was the first thing he said. Not "good morning," not "how are you." The horses. "Philip," Margaret said. "The horses, the carriage, the silver. Margaret, I need you to make a list of everything in this house that can be sold without attracting attention. You cannot be serious. I am entirely serious. The debts are restored. The interest alone is more than we can service. If we do not begin selling assets immediately, we will lose the house. The word house hung in the air like a sentence. Ashford Manor, the only home Eleonora had ever known. The rooms where she had learned to walk and talk and curtsy in 4 regional styles. The garden, where she had pulled weeds until her mind went quiet. The desk, where she had written lists and burned pages and whispered questions to the dark. How long? Margaret asked. 6 months, perhaps less, depending on how quickly the creditors move. 6 months, 180 days to dismantle a life that had taken generations to build. Eleonora sat at the breakfast table and listened to her parents discuss the liquidation of their existence with the numb, floating detachment of a person watching their own house burn from across a street, close enough to feel the heat, far enough to know there is nothing to be done. The horses were sold first, then the carriage, then the silver, piece by piece, each departure leaving a gap in the household that could not be filled, an empty stable, an empty coach house, an empty shelf in the dining room, where the candelabra had stood for 40 years. Eleonora watched her childhood home be dismantled around her, and felt, underneath the grief and the shock and the residual numbness, something she had not expected to feel. Relief. It was small. It was buried. It was wrong, and she knew it was wrong, because you are not supposed to feel relief when your family is being financially destroyed. But the relief was there, and it was real, and it came from a place so deep inside her that she could not have removed it, even if she had wanted to. Because the plan was gone. The structure was gone. The contract, the training, the dress, the necklace, the 400 invitations, the 8-course menu, the 1,200 roses, all of it was gone. And in its absence, in the rubble and the ruin and the financial catastrophe, there was something Eleonora had never encountered before, in her 22 years of carefully managed existence. Space. Empty, terrifying, exhilarating space. Space where a life could be built. Not a life designed by other people for other people's purposes. A life she might, if she were brave enough, if she were foolish enough, if she were desperate enough, design for herself. She was not ready for it yet. The space was too big, and too empty, and too frightening, and she was too raw, and too damaged, and too recently broken to know what to do with it. But it was there. And for the first time in 22 years, the future was not a road paved by someone else. It was an open field, and Eleonora was standing at the edge of it, barefoot, cold, stripped of everything she had been given, and everything she had been told she was, and the field stretched out in every direction, unmarked and unmapped, and the only footprints in it would be her own. 3 weeks after the wedding, that was not a wedding, Cedric married Vivian Carr in a private ceremony in London, attended by 12 people, none of whom were Hale family members, and all of whom were friends of the bride. Eleonora learned about it from a newspaper, not even the front page, page 4, a small column between an advertisement for patent medicine and a report on wool prices. The Duke of Thornbury had married Lady Vivian Carr, widow, at a chapel in Mayfair. The bride wore blue. The groom looked relieved. She read the column while standing in the kitchen of Ashford Manor, because the morning room was being prepared for a visit from a potential buyer who was interested in the furniture, and the kitchen was the only room in the house that was not currently being staged for sale. The bride wore blue. Eleonora folded the newspaper and set it on the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the garden where nothing grew in January and thought about the color blue, how Vivian had worn blue to her wedding, how Eleonora had worn ivory, how the choice of color said everything about the difference between the two events. Ivory was tradition. Ivory was expectation. Ivory was a color chosen by someone else for someone else's reasons. Blue was deliberate. Blue was personal. Blue was the color of a woman who had arrived at her own wedding, wearing exactly what she wanted, because nobody had ever told her otherwise. Eleonora was not angry at Vivian. This surprised people. It surprised Margaret, who expected rage and received silence. It surprised the neighbors, who expected bitterness and received courtesy. It surprised Charlotte, who expected tears and received a calm, steady gaze that was more unsettling than any amount of weeping. "You are not angry?" Charlotte asked during one of her visits, sitting in the kitchen, because the drawing room no longer contained chairs. I am angry, Eleonora said, but not at her. At Cedric? Not at Cedric. Charlotte waited. Eleonora arranged 2 cups on a tray and poured tea from a pot that was one of 6 items remaining from the original service, and thought about the precise location of her anger, which was not where anyone expected it to be. I am angry at the contract, she said. I am angry at the system that produced the contract. I am angry at a world in which 2 men can sit in a study and sign away a child's future and call it business, and everyone around them nods and smiles and buys the orchids and hires the dressmaker, and not a single person, not one, raises their hand and says, "Has anyone asked the girl?" She set the teapot down. Her hand was steady. Her voice was steady. Everything about her was steady, in the way that things become steady when the shaking has been so prolonged and so violent that the body simply stops, exhausted, unable to sustain the vibration any longer. I was not a person, Charlotte. I was a line item. I was an entry in a ledger that balanced 2 men's accounts. My entire childhood, my education, my deportment training, my languages, my curtsy in 4 regional styles, all of it was packaging. I was being wrapped, and when the recipient declined the package, everyone acted as though the tragedy was the decline, and nobody noticed that the real tragedy was the wrapping. Charlotte reached across the kitchen table and took her hand, and the contact was warm and real, and cost Eleonora nothing, which was such a novel experience that she almost laughed. "What are you going to do?" Charlotte asked. Eleonora had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the house creaked around her, and her parents slept their separate, troubled sleeps, and the future stretched out before her like a road she had never seen, unmarked, unmapped, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "I am going to sell the dress," she said. Charlotte blinked. "The wedding dress? It cost more than the cook earns in a decade. It is Belgian lace and ivory silk, and it has 32 buttons, and it has never been worn for its intended purpose, and it is hanging in my wardrobe, like a monument to a life I am no longer obligated to live. I am going to sell it, and use the money." Use the money for what? Eleonora looked out the kitchen window. January had given way to February, and the garden was still barren, still frozen, still waiting for the warmth that would thaw the ground and allow things to grow. But underneath the frozen surface, she knew, things were already moving. Roots were spreading. Seeds were preparing. The machinery of growth was operating in silence, invisible, patient, unstoppable. "I am going to go to Florence," she said. The word landed in the kitchen like something bright and unfamiliar, a color that had never been seen in the gray, diminished landscape of Ashford Manor. Florence. A city Eleonora had never visited, in a country Eleonora had learned the language of, for a reason Eleonora had never examined, but that she now understood, with the clarity of someone who has been blind and has opened their eyes. She had learned Italian, not because Mrs. Crawley had recommended it, and not because Margaret had insisted. She had learned Italian because Italian was the one language nobody had told her to learn. French was required, Latin was useful, Italian was her own. She had chosen it the way a prisoner scratches a mark on a wall, a small, secret act of ownership in a life defined by other people's decisions. Florence was Italian. Florence was hers. "Florence," Charlotte repeated. She said it the way you say the name of a place you have heard about, but never imagined visiting, with a mixture of admiration and alarm. "Eleonora, you cannot simply go to Florence." "Why not?" "You are a young woman, unmarried, alone, in a foreign country. It is not done." Eleonora smiled, not the Duchess smile, something new, something with teeth and edges, and the particular, dangerous warmth of a woman who has recently discovered that the rules she has been following her entire life were not commandments from on high, but suggestions from people who were not even paying attention. "A great many things that are not done should be done, Charlotte. And I have spent 22 years doing only the things that are done. And where has it gotten me? A kitchen without chairs, a father in a locked study, a mother who blames me for a decision a man made. I am finished with what is done. I am interested in what is possible." She sold the dress. Madame Lucille, who had constructed it, was horrified, and then practical, and then calculating, and she offered a price that was significantly less than the original cost, but significantly more than Eleonora had expected. Because Belgian lace does not depreciate, and ivory silk is always in demand, and the scandal attached to the garment actually increased its value, as scandals tend to do with things that are already expensive. The money was enough, not enough for luxury, not enough for permanence, but enough for a passage to Florence, and 3 months of modest accommodation, and the opportunity to discover whether the person underneath the Duchess was someone worth being. Philip objected. His objection was financial rather than paternal, rooted not in concern for his daughter's safety, but in concern for the money she was spending on herself, rather than contributing to the family's collapsing finances. Margaret objected on principle, because Margaret's principles were the last things she had left, and abandoning them would have meant abandoning the final structure in a life where every other structure had fallen. "You will be ruined," Margaret said. "A young woman traveling alone. The reputation you have left will be destroyed." "Mama, my reputation was destroyed in a chapel in front of 400 people. The reputation I have left is the reputation of a girl who was not enough. I do not want that reputation. I do not want any reputation. I want a life." Margaret stared at her daughter, and for one moment, one brief, piercing moment, she saw her. Not the Duchess she had been building, not the girl she had been training, not the instrument of social ascension she had been crafting for 22 years. She saw Eleonora, the actual, individual, specific human being who existed beneath all the layers, and the human being was fierce, and frightened, and determined, and completely, utterly, irreversibly done. Margaret opened her mouth to argue. Then she closed it. It was the first time in Eleonora's life that her mother had chosen not to speak, and the silence was louder than any words would have been. Eleonora left on a Tuesday in March. The morning was cold and gray, the standard English spring morning, all promise and no delivery. She carried one trunk containing the clothes she actually liked, rather than the clothes she had been told to wear, 3 books she had chosen herself, and a notebook that was new and blank, with no lists in it, no entries, no questions she was afraid to answer. Charlotte came to see her off. They stood at the front door of Ashford Manor, which was smaller than Eleonora remembered it being, or perhaps she was larger. The proportions of everything had shifted since the chapel. The house that had once been the center of her world was now a waypoint, a place she was leaving, rather than a place she belonged. "Write to me," Charlotte said. "Every week. Every day." Eleonora laughed. The sound surprised them both. It came out of her like something that had been stored in a locked room for years, slightly dusty, slightly creaky, but real. Undeniably, unperformably real. "Every day is a lot of postage, Charlotte. I do not care about postage. I care about you. Write to me, and tell me everything. Tell me what Florence looks like. Tell me what the food tastes like. Tell me what it feels like to walk down a street where nobody knows you are the girl who was not enough." Eleonora took Charlotte's hands. She held them the way Charlotte had held hers on the gray path between the hedgerows, firmly, with the specific pressure of a grip that means I will not let go even though I have to. "I was never the girl who was not enough," she said. "I was the girl who was too much. Too much for a contract, too much for a title, too much for a man who wanted furniture and got a person. The problem was never that I was not enough. The problem was that I was standing in the wrong room." She let go of Charlotte's hands. She climbed into the hired carriage, because the family carriage had been sold 3 weeks ago. She settled onto the seat. The trunk was loaded. The driver clicked his tongue. The horses moved. Ashford Manor receded behind her. The hedgerows slid past. The lane narrowed and turned and joined the road. And the road led south and east, toward the coast, toward a ship, toward a country she had never seen, toward a language she had chosen, toward a life that had no outline, no map, no contract, no 32 buttons, no miniature portrait, no 1,200 roses. She opened the new notebook. She picked up a pen. She wrote, "Day 1. And then she wrote nothing else, because the page was blank, and the blankness was beautiful, and she was not ready to fill it with words, because filling it with words would have been another kind of control, and she was done with control. She closed the notebook. She looked out the window. England moved past her, green and gray and wet and familiar. and she watched it go with the particular expression of someone who is not running away from something but walking towards something else, something they cannot see yet, something they have never been taught, something that exists beyond the edge of everything they have ever known. The ship left from Dover. Eleonora stood on the deck as the white cliffs receded, and the wind pulled at her hair, the hair that Rose had pinned and curled on the morning of the wedding, the hair that was now loose and unpinned and doing whatever it wanted. And the wind was cold, and the sea was gray, and the cliffs were white, and everything was its own color, unmanaged, uncoordinated, unmatched, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She stood on the deck for a long time. She did not look back. Florence hit Eleonora like a language she had always understood, but never been permitted to speak. The city was loud, chaotic, aggressive in its beauty, shoving color and light and noise at her from every direction without apology or warning. After 22 years in the muted, controlled palette of English country life, Florence was an assault, and Eleonora stood on the Via dei Calzaiuoli on her first morning and felt her senses overload the way a muscle overloads when it is used for the first time after a long period of stillness. Everything ached. Everything sang. She had rented a room in a pensione near the Arno, a narrow building with peeling yellow walls and shutters that did not quite close, and a landlady named Signora Bertini, who was 60, widowed, and in possession of an opinion on every subject that existed, and several that did not. Signora Bertini took one look at Eleonora, pale English girl with a single trunk and an expression of terrified determination, and made the assessment that would define their relationship for the next 3 months. "You are running from something," she said in Italian. It was not a question. "I am running toward something," Eleonora replied, also in Italian, and Signora Bertini raised her eyebrows and reconsidered, because people who run toward things are more interesting than people who run from them. The room was small, a bed, a chair, a table, a window overlooking a courtyard where someone was growing tomatoes in clay pots. The walls were white and bare, and the floor was tile, and the light came in through the imperfect shutters in stripes that moved across the room as the day progressed, marking time in angles of sun rather than clicks of a clock. Eleonora unpacked her trunk. She placed her 3 books on the table. She set her notebook beside them. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the space and thought about the 47 rooms of Thornbury Hall and the 14 rooms of Ashford Manor and the single, small, plain room she was standing in now, and she felt something expand in her chest, a sensation of opening, of air filling a space that had been compressed for too long. She did not know what to do. This was the first time in her life that she genuinely did not know what to do, and the not knowing was exhilarating and paralyzing in equal measure. For 22 years, every hour of every day had been assigned a purpose: wake, dress, breakfast, lessons, practice, fitting, dinner, sleep. The schedule had been her skeleton, the structure that held her upright, and without it she was formless. A liquid poured out of its container, spreading in every direction, finding no shape. She sat on the bed. She picked up the notebook. She wrote, "What do I want to do today?" The question sat on the page like a detonation. 5 words that contained more freedom than 22 years of obedience. She stared at them and felt the full weight of their implication, which was that the answer was entirely up to her. Nobody was going to tell her. Nobody was going to coach her. Nobody was going to select her dress or arrange her hair or instruct her on the proper way to experience the day. The day was hers. The decision was hers. The consequences, for the first time, were entirely her own. She wrote, "Walk." She walked. Florence unfolded around her like a book she had never read. Each street a new page. Each piazza a new chapter. She walked without direction, without destination, without the measured 1, 2, 3, 4 rhythm that had governed her steps since childhood. She walked the way children walk, following whatever caught her attention, turning down streets because she liked the color of the building at the corner, or because she heard music from an open window, or because the alley was narrow and shadowed, and she wanted to know where it led. She walked through the Boboli Gardens and stood among statues that had been standing for 400 years and were not waiting for anyone. She walked along the Arno and watched the light on the water change color as the afternoon progressed, gold to amber to copper. She walked through the market at San Lorenzo and touched leather and silk and olive wood and felt the textures under her fingers with the sensory hunger of someone who has been wearing gloves for 22 years and has just taken them off. She ate food she had never tasted, ribollita from a cart near the Palazzo Vecchio, thick and hot and tasting of bread and beans, and the particular, earthy generosity of a cuisine that does not believe in restraint. Gelato, from a shop on the Via Ghibellina, pistachio and lemon, 2 scoops in a cone that melted faster than she could eat it, and dripped down her wrist, and she licked it off her skin, without thinking, without checking whether anyone was watching, without hearing her mother's voice telling her that a lady does not lick food from her own body. She did not hear her mother's voice once that day. The silence was extraordinary. In the weeks that followed, Eleonora built a routine, but it was her routine, assembled from her own preferences rather than imposed by someone else's expectations. She woke when she woke. She ate when she was hungry. She walked when she wanted to walk, and sat when she wanted to sit, and read when she wanted to read, and did nothing when she wanted to do nothing. And the doing of nothing was the most radical act she had ever committed, because doing nothing requires the belief that your time has value, even when it is not being used for someone else's purpose. And this was a belief Eleonora was learning for the first time. She found the university, a small, old building near the Piazza della Signoria that offered lectures open to the public, and she attended one on a Tuesday morning because the topic was botanical illustration, and she had mentioned botanical illustration in the only honest letter she had ever written to Cedric, the letter about the robin's nest and the autumn colors, the letter where she had tried to be a person and had been received with 2 syllables and a signature. The lecture was given by a professor named Dr. Marco Salvi, who was 40, bald, enthusiastic, and in love with plants, the way some people are in love with music, completely, irrationally, with a devotion that transcended reason and entered the territory of faith. He spoke about the history of botanical illustration, about the artists who had traveled the world to record plants in their natural habitats, about the particular challenge of capturing a living thing on paper, of translating 3 dimensions into 2, of preserving movement and growth, and the specific quality of light filtering through a leaf onto a page. Eleonora sat in the lecture hall and felt something ignite. It was not a dramatic ignition, not a bonfire, more like a match struck in a dark room, a small, sudden flare of warmth and light that illuminated, for the briefest moment, a shape she had not known was there. The shape was an interest, a genuine, unforced, unassigned interest, in something that had nothing to do with contracts or titles or the management of 47 rooms. She wanted to draw plants. The wanting was so simple and so specific that it shocked her. She had spent 22 years wanting things that were abstract and unachievable, wanting to be asked, wanting to be chosen, wanting to be seen. And now, sitting in a lecture hall in Florence with sunlight coming through the high windows and a bald professor describing the anatomy of a fern frond, she wanted something concrete, something she could do with her own hands, something that was hers. She approached Dr. Salvi after the lecture. He looked at her with the distracted friendliness of a man who has just given a lecture and is still partially inhabiting the world of his subject. "I would like to study botanical illustration," she said. "In Italian." He blinked. "You speak Italian?" "I taught myself." "Why?" She considered the question. The honest answer was complicated and painful, and involved contracts and chapels, and 22 years of being prepared for a life that someone else had chosen. The simple answer was easier. "Because nobody told me to." Dr. Salvi looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was the smile of a teacher who has just recognized a student, not by their credentials or their background, but by the particular quality of hunger in their eyes. The hunger that says, "I want to learn something because I want to learn it, not because someone else has decided I should." "Come back on Thursday," he said. "Bring a pencil." She came back on Thursday. She brought a pencil. She began to draw. The first drawings were terrible, clumsy, disproportionate, with lines that wavered and shading that pooled in the wrong places. She drew a lavender sprig that looked like a purple accident. She drew an olive branch that looked like it had been sketched during an earthquake. She showed them to Dr. Salvi, who looked at them with the patient, unflinching honesty of a man who believes that the truth, even when it hurts, is always preferable to the lie. These are bad, he said. I know. Good. Knowing they are bad means you can see. Most beginners think their work is good, which means they are blind. You can see. We can work with seeing. They worked. Weeks of work. Eleonora drew every day, sitting in the courtyard of the pensione with Signora Bertini's tomato plants as her subjects, sketching the leaves and the stems and the small, hard green fruits that were slowly swelling in the spring warmth. She drew badly, and then less badly, and then adequately, and then, slowly, patiently, with the incremental improvement of a person who is learning something for the right reasons. She drew well. She wrote to Charlotte every week, as promised. The letters were long and detailed, and full of the particular breathless energy of a person who is discovering that the world is larger and stranger and more generous than they were ever told. She described Florence and the food and the art and the light. She described Dr. Salvi and the lectures and the drawings. She described Signora Bertini, who had begun teaching her to cook and who approached the education with the same intensity Margaret had brought to deportment lessons, but with the crucial difference that Signora Bertini's lessons ended with something delicious rather than something restrictive. Charlotte wrote back. She wrote about George and the garden and the green curtains they had compromised on, which were actually teal, and about the baby that was coming in the autumn, and about the village gossip, which was still, months later, centered on the scandal at Thornbury Chapel. People are beginning to forget, Charlotte wrote. Not forget exactly, but the sharpness is fading. The story is becoming a story rather than a scandal. People tell it the way they tell fairy tales, with a beginning and a middle but no agreed-upon ending, because nobody knows what happened to the bride. Nobody knew what happened to the bride. Eleonora read this line in the courtyard of the pensione, with graphite on her fingers, and a half-finished drawing of a basil plant on the table beside her, and she thought about the phrase, happened to, and how it assumed that things happened to people, rather than because of people. How it cast her as an object rather than a subject, a character in someone else's story rather than the author of her own. She picked up her pencil. She went back to the basil. Spring became summer. Summer in Florence was a different country from spring in Florence, hotter and louder and slower, the city moving at half speed under a sun that seemed to have taken a personal interest in baking every cobblestone to the temperature of bread. Eleonora adapted. She woke earlier, before the heat. She worked in the cool mornings and rested in the hot afternoons, and walked in the evenings, when the air softened and the light turned the color of honey. Her drawings improved. Dr. Salvi began displaying them in the lecture hall, and students and visitors would stop to examine them, and Eleonora would watch them looking at her work and feel a sensation she had never experienced before, a quiet, steady warmth that had nothing to do with approval and everything to do with the knowledge that she had made something with her own hands, from her own vision, for her own reasons. She was not performing, she was creating. The distinction was the difference between everything she had been and everything she was becoming. The 3 months she had budgeted became 4, then 5. The money stretched further than expected because Eleonora had discovered that living simply was not a hardship but a preference. She did not need 47 rooms. She did not need orchids or Belgian lace or an 8-course menu. She needed a room with a window, a pencil, a plant to draw, a language to speak, a teacher who told her the truth, a landlady who fed her and argued with her and treated her like a human being rather than a title. She needed so much less than she had been told. In September, a journalist tracked her down, an English writer named Mr. Oliver Finch, who was based in Rome and had been assigned to write a retrospective piece about the Thornbury scandal for a London publication. He appeared at the door of the pensione on a Tuesday afternoon, sweating in a linen suit that had been appropriate for Rome but was wilting in Florence, and he asked Signora Bertini in terrible Italian whether Lady Eleonora Ashford was a resident. Signora Bertini looked at him the way she looked at pigeons that landed on her tomato plants. Who is asking? Oliver Finch, London Illustrated. I am writing a story. She is not a story. She is a person. There is a difference. Wait here. Signora Bertini climbed the stairs and knocked on Eleonora's door and delivered the news with the blunt efficiency that characterized all her communications. There is a man downstairs who wants to write about you. He is English and sweating. Do you want to speak to him? Eleonora considered. She could refuse. She had every right to refuse. The scandal was behind her, and the life she was building in Florence was private and precious, and entirely her own, and she owed nothing to any journalist from any publication. But the story was still being told without her. In drawing rooms and newspapers in the fairy tale version Charlotte had described, the narrative of the Thornbury scandal was being shaped by people who had not lived it, and the ending was either tragic or comic, depending on who was telling it, and in neither version did the bride have a voice. "I will speak to him," she said. She met Oliver Finch in the courtyard. She offered him water and a chair and the shade of Signora Bertini's olive tree, and he sat down with the relieved gratitude of a man who has been walking in the heat for longer than he planned. He was younger than she expected, 30 perhaps, wire-rimmed spectacles, a notebook that was identical to the ones she had been using her entire life, which she noticed, and which made her almost smile. "Lady Eleonora, thank you for seeing me." Eleonora, just Eleonora. He noted this. Pen to paper, the scratch of graphite, a sound she now associated with her own work rather than other people's assessments of her. "I would like to ask you about the events at Thornbury Chapel," you may ask. "Do you feel that the Duke treated you unfairly?" Eleonora looked at the olive tree. The leaves moved in a breeze she could not feel, silver green, catching the light and releasing it, and she thought about the question, which was the question everyone wanted the answer to, the question that would determine whether the story was a tragedy or a scandal or something else entirely. "The Dave made a choice," she said. "He chose a woman he loved over a woman he was obligated to. I do not think that is unfair. I think it is human. What was unfair was not his choice. What was unfair was the system that made his choice devastating. Two men signed a contract over a baby girl. That contract determined the course of her life for 22 years. It determined her education, her training, her wardrobe, her expectations, her sense of self. And when the contract was broken, the girl was left with nothing, not because the Duke took something from her, but because everything she had been given was the contract. Everything she was had been built on a foundation that was never hers." Oliver Finch wrote quickly. His pen moved across the page with the focused urgency of a man who knows he is getting something good and is afraid of losing it. "And now?" he asked. "What are you now?" "I am a student. I am learning to draw plants. I am living in a room above a courtyard where a woman grows tomatoes. I am discovering that the life I was told I needed is not the life I actually need. I am finding out what happens when you remove every expectation and every obligation and every contract and every button and every pin and every gold-lettered invitation, and you stand in the empty space that is left, and you ask yourself, what do you want? And what do you want?" Eleonora smiled. Not the Duchess smile, not the bride smile. A smile she had built herself in Florence, from scratch, using materials she had gathered during months of walking and drawing, and eating gelato off her own wrist, and learning to cook from a woman who argued with her about olive oil.
"I want to draw this olive tree,"
she said. "And then I want to eat dinner, and then I want to sleep in my own bed, in my own room, and wake up tomorrow and decide, for myself, what tomorrow looks like. That is what I want. That is all I want, and it is more than I have ever had." Oliver Finch asked one more question. The question everyone asked. The question that would become the headline, the pull quote, the sentence that would define the story when it was published 3 weeks later in a London periodical that was read by exactly the kind of people who had attended the wedding and exactly the kind of people who had discussed the scandal over dinner. "Have you forgiven him?" Eleonora looked at the journalist. She looked at his notebook. She looked at the olive tree and the tomato plants and the yellow walls of the pensione and the stripe of late afternoon sunlight that was falling across the courtyard table, illuminating her unfinished drawing of the basil plant, the drawing that was good, genuinely good, the product of months of work and failure and patience, and the slow, difficult, beautiful process of learning to do something for the right reasons. "He did not ruin me," she said. "He released me. The cruelty is that nobody thought to ask if I wanted releasing. They just assumed the cage was the gift." Oliver Finch wrote the words down. He thanked her. He left. Eleonora sat in the courtyard for a long time after he was gone. The sunlight moved across the table and reached her hands and warmed them, and she picked up her pencil and turned to the olive tree and began to draw. The lines were steady. The shading was precise. The tree took shape on the page, leaf by leaf, branch by branch, a living thing, captured by a hand that had learned to see, and the seeing was the thing, the whole thing, the only thing that mattered. She drew until the light failed, then she went inside. Signora Bertini had made pasta with a sauce that involved arguments about tomatoes and an unreasonable quantity of garlic, and they ate together at the kitchen table and argued about whether the pasta was overcooked, which it was, slightly, but the arguing was the point, not the pasta, and the arguing was warm and honest and real. After dinner, Eleonora went to her room. She opened her notebook. She looked at the first entry, written months ago on the morning she arrived. Day 1. She turned to today's page. She wrote, Day 187. I drew an olive tree. I ate pasta. I argued about garlic. I told a journalist the truth. I did not wear 32 buttons. I did not curtsy. I did not perform. I was myself. It was enough. She closed the notebook. She turned off the lamp. She lay in bed in her small room with the imperfect shutters and listened to Florence breathe around her, the distant sound of traffic and voices and music from a restaurant down the street, and she thought about the girl who had stood at the altar of Thornbury Chapel, in ivory silk and Belgian lace, with a bouquet tilting left and a lifetime of preparation crumbling around her. That girl was gone. Not dead. Not forgotten. Not even entirely left behind. She was there, somewhere, in the architecture of Eleonora's posture, and the precision of her speech, and the particular way she held a teacup, traces of the training that would never fully disappear, marks left by a chisel on stone that can be weathered but not erased. But the girl at the altar was not the whole story. She was the middle. The beginning was a contract signed over a baby girl in a study that smelled of brandy, and the ending was here, a room in Florence, a notebook on a table, a pencil with graphite worn down to a nub from months of drawing things she loved. The ending was not dramatic. It was not grand. It did not involve a chapel or a dress or 400 witnesses or 1,200 roses. It involved a woman lying in bed in the dark, listening to a city she had chosen, thinking about a life she was building, feeling, for the first time in 22 years, the specific, irreplaceable, unperformable sensation of being exactly where she wanted to be. The tragedy was the 22 years before the altar. Everything after was just life. Messy, unchoreographed, imperfect, full of overcooked pasta and arguments about garlic, and drawings that started badly and got better, and a landlady who grew tomatoes, and a professor who told the truth, and a friend who wrote letters, and a world that was larger and stranger and more generous than anyone had ever told her. Hers. Unmistakably, irreversibly, finally hers.